a billionaire, a little girl, a chessboard that changed everything. She sat across from one of the most powerful women in the country, 8 years old, sneakers untied, completely unafraid. And in 17 moves, she made Victoria Sterling cry. Not because she won, because the way she played reminded Victoria of someone she had spent 8 years trying to forget. Herself. What happened next would tear 3 lives apart and force all of them to ask the only question that actually matters. When the truth finally comes out, is love strong enough to survive it? If you've ever had to fight for the people you love most, this story is for you. Drop the name of your city in the comments and hit that like button. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The elevator was broken again. Mason Hart stood in the lobby of the Crestfield building with his toolbox in one hand, his work order in the other, and his 8-year-old daughter pressed against his left side like she was attached there with industrial adhesive. The security desk had already looked at him twice. He didn't blame them. A guy in a faded blue work shirt hauling a scratched-up toolbox through the marble-floored entrance of one of the most expensive corporate towers in the city wasn't exactly their usual Monday morning foot traffic. "Dad?" Lily said quietly, tugging his sleeve. "I know. The floor is really shiny. I know that too. Do you think they clean it every day or just—" "Lily." He looked down at her. She was staring at her own reflection in the polished stone floor, tilting her head slightly, the way she always did when she was working something out. Her backpack had a small patch of dried paint on the left strap from a project she'd done 2 weeks ago. Her sneaker was untied. Again. "Stay close to me, okay? We're not supposed to be here together. I just need to get this done, and then we'll go get lunch. Whatever you want." "Chipotle?" "Within reason." She almost smiled. Almost. Lily had her mother's mouth, the slight asymmetry of it, the way the left corner moved a half-second before the right. Mason had stopped noticing that years ago, or at least he'd gotten better at not letting himself notice it. He crouched down and retied her lace in a double knot, then stood back up and walked to the security desk. The morning had started falling apart at 6:45. His regular babysitter, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Donahue, who lived 2 floors below them, had called in a thin, apologetic voice to tell him she'd woken up with what sounded like the beginning of a chest cold. She was sorry. She knew it was short notice. He'd told her not to worry about it. And he meant it. He genuinely meant it, Mrs. Donahue was one of the good ones. But the moment he hung up the phone, he'd stood in the kitchen for a full 45 seconds just staring at the coffee maker, running calculations. His supervisor at Heartland Technical Services, a company that contracted with commercial buildings across the metro area, was not a flexible man. Dave Kellerman had a way of saying "I understand" that communicated the exact opposite. Mason had called in once this year already, back in February, when Lily had a fever that spiked to 103. Dave had said "I understand" twice in that conversation. The second time, Mason had felt it land like a warning shot. He had 2 jobs on the books today. The first was a routine HVAC inspection at a dental office in Midtown. Easy work, 2 hours max. The second was a significantly more complicated assignment. A climate control system malfunction in the server room of Sterling Industries, located on the 41st floor of the Crestfield building. The Sterling job paid almost 3 times the rate of the dental office. It was the kind of work order that covered a week's worth of grocery runs, plus Lily's after-school program, plus the small amount he set aside every month in a savings account that he tried not to look at too often because the number made his chest tighten. He could not cancel the Sterling job. He had thought about it for 30 seconds and then dismissed the idea entirely. Lily had taken it well, the way she usually took things. She'd eaten her toast, put her book in her backpack. She was deep into a collection of historical chess games, annotated, which was not a normal thing for an 8-year-old to voluntarily read, but Mason had learned to stop questioning what Lily chose to be interested in, and climbed into the truck without complaint. She'd asked if she could use his phone to play music, and he'd said yes, and she'd put on something instrumental and quiet that he didn't recognize, and they'd driven the 40 minutes downtown without arguing once. It was, by their standards, an excellent morning. The security guard at the Crestfield building was named Gerald, according to his badge. Gerald was 50-ish, heavy-set, with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to give nothing away on the job. He looked at Mason's work order. He looked at Lily. He looked back at the work order. The child isn't listed as an authorized visitor. She's with me, Mason said. I'm the authorized visitor. She's 8. Building policy requires all visitors to be pre-registered. She's my daughter. She's not visiting anyone. She's just... Mason stopped himself, pressed the heel of his hand briefly against the edge of the desk. Look, my childcare fell through this morning. I've got a service call scheduled on 41. Climate control in the server room. If I don't show up, whoever handles your company's IT infrastructure is going to have a very bad afternoon. And I don't think the people on 41 are going to be particularly understanding about why their server room baked itself, because Gerald at the security desk wouldn't let my 8-year-old ride the elevator with me. Gerald looked at him for a moment. She'll stay with me the whole time, Mason added. I've got headphones for her. She'll sit quietly. She won't touch anything. I can touch things, Lily said helpfully. I just won't. Gerald looked at her. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. He picked up the phone on his desk. Let me call up to 41. They cleared security at 8:52. The elevator that took them to the 41st floor was the kind that moved so smoothly you couldn't feel it. Lily pressed her back against the wall and watched the floor number climb. Mason watched her watch it. You good? He asked. Yeah. She chewed her thumbnail for a second, then stopped herself. She was trying to break that habit, had been trying for months, and pulled her hand down. Is it a big company? Sterling Industries. Yeah, it's big. What do they make? They don't really make anything. It's complicated. They own other companies. Real estate, some tech, some manufacturing. The woman who runs it inherited part of it and built the rest herself. He'd read the briefing notes Dave had sent over. Standard stuff, but he'd learned years ago to know a little about wherever he was going. Victoria Sterling. Lily turned the name over. That's a serious name. She's apparently a serious person. Do you think she's mean? I think people who run companies like this are usually, I don't know, focused. It's not the same as mean. But it's not the same as nice either. Mason didn't answer that because it wasn't really a question. The 41st floor opened into a reception area that made the lobby downstairs look modest. Pale gray walls, clean lines, a curved desk where a young woman in a structured blazer looked up as they stepped off the elevator. Beyond the reception area, through a set of glass doors, Mason could see a long corridor, offices with floor-to-ceiling windows, and further back, the kind of open workspace that signaled money. Not the loud, obvious kind, but the quieter, more deliberate kind that said, we don't need to show you anything. Mason Hart, Heartland Technical, he said to the receptionist. I've got a service call for the server room. She confirmed his name, printed a badge, and handed it over without smiling. Then she looked at Lily. And this is? My daughter. I spoke with someone on the phone this morning about the situation. Right. The receptionist, her name tag said Priya, glanced past him toward the corridor, seemed to calculate something briefly. Our facilities coordinator is currently in a meeting. She asked me to let you know you can set up in the server room directly. It's down the hall, third door on the left. Keypad code is 7714. She looked at Lily again. Is there somewhere your daughter can wait that's comfortable? We have a small conference room that's empty today. That works, Mason said. Thank you. Awesome. The conference room was small and neutral and looked out over the city through one long window. There was a round table, 4 chairs, a credenza along one wall, and tucked into the corner near the window, something that stopped Lily dead in the doorway. A chessboard. Not a standard tournament board. This was something else entirely. The board itself was inlaid stone, alternating squares of white marble and deep green serpentine, set in a frame of what looked like dark walnut. The pieces were hand-carved, heavier than usual, the kind of set that sat in a room not because anyone was actively playing, but because it looked exactly right in that space. Some of the pieces were mid-game, arranged in a position that wasn't random. Lily walked toward it like she'd been pulled by a string. Don't touch it, Mason said automatically. I'm not touching it. She bent at the waist and studied the board, hands clasped behind her back. a habit she'd picked up from a YouTube video of professional chess players reviewing games. Someone left a game in progress. Yeah, it's not a casual game. She tilted her head. White is in trouble. See how the queen's been pushed back to the edge? Whoever's playing black has been patient. They've been building pressure for at least the last 10 moves, probably more. White doesn't even realize how bad their position is yet. Mason set her backpack down on the table. How do you know they don't realize? Because if they did, they would have started trying to trade pieces by now. They're still playing like they're going to win. She straightened up. They're not going to win. He looked at the board for a moment. He could play chess. His grandfather had taught him. He knew the rules. He could hold his own in a casual game. But Lily had gone several thousand miles past him in that department sometime around the age of 6. And these days when she talked about a board position, he mostly just trusted her. Okay, he said. Don't move anything. I'll check in on you in an hour. Do you have your book? Yeah. And your headphones? Yeah. If anyone comes in and asks you to leave, you come find me. The server room is the third door on the left from the elevator. Do not wander around. Do not talk to strangers unless you have to. Do not, Dad. She looked at him with the particular patience she reserved for when he was repeating himself. I know. He looked at her for a second. 8 years old. He was still not entirely used to the way time had moved. It felt like 6 months ago she was learning to read. 3 months ago she was losing her first tooth. And now she was standing in a Billionaire's conference room analyzing chess positions that probably would have taken him an hour to work out with a notepad. 1 hour, he said. Maybe a little more. You'll be okay. Dad, I'm fine. Go fix the air conditioner. He went to fix the air conditioner. Victoria Sterling did not usually arrive at the office before 9. This was not widely known, because she was always in her office before 9. She simply came in through the private entrance on the 41st floor, bypassing the main lobby entirely, so there was no public record of her arrival time and no security guard to log when she stepped off the elevator. She had started using the private entrance approximately 2 years ago, after a local business publication ran a piece on her morning routine and a photographer had started showing up near the main entrance around 7:30. She hadn't been angry about the article exactly. She'd just made a quiet adjustment and moved on. On this particular Monday, she arrived at 8:48, 4 minutes before Mason Hart cleared security downstairs, which meant she had been in the building for exactly 11 minutes when she walked down the corridor toward her office, paused at the conference room she sometimes used for smaller meetings, and looked through the glass panel in the door. There was a child sitting at the table. Not sitting at the table, actually. Leaning over the chessboard in the corner, which was Victoria's board, the one she kept in that room because she sometimes worked through positions during long conference calls when she needed something to do with her hands. The child had her hands behind her back and was studying the board with an intensity that Victoria found oddly arresting. She stood at the door for a moment. The girl was small, maybe 7 or 8, with dark hair pulled back in a slightly uneven ponytail and a backpack sitting open on the table. She wasn't touching anything. She was just looking. After a moment, she murmured something to herself, barely audible through the glass, and shifted her weight slightly. Victoria pushed the door open. The girl looked up. She didn't startle the way most children would have. She just looked up, registered Victoria's presence, and said, "Hi." "Hello," Victoria said. "Who are you?" "Lily Hart. My dad is fixing your air conditioning." She looked at the board, then back at Victoria. "Sorry, I didn't touch anything. I was just looking." "I can see that." Victoria stepped into the room. She was in her usual Monday clothes, dark wool trousers, a cream-colored blouse, no visible jewelry except a simple watch on her left wrist. She looked at the board. "What do you think of the position?" Lily glanced at her, checking whether she was being tested, Victoria guessed. Then she apparently decided it didn't matter either way and said, "White is going to lose. They're about 6 moves away from realizing it, and by then it'll be too late." Victoria looked at the board herself. She had set up that position 3 days ago from a tournament game she'd been studying. A match from a regional invitational held the previous spring, 2 strong amateur players, the kind of game that had a deceptively simple surface and a complicated interior. "Why do you say it'll be too late in 6 moves?" Lily pointed, not touching, just indicating, at the black knight on d5. This piece. It looks passive right now, but it's not. Once black plays here, she traced the air above the board. And here, that knight becomes the most dangerous piece on the board. White's going to spend the next 5 moves doing something else and not notice until it's already over. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Do you play? Yeah. How long? Since I was 5. My dad taught me the rules, but I mostly taught myself after that. She said it without self-consciousness, not bragging, just stating a fact the way she'd state any other fact. We do puzzles together sometimes, but he says I've passed the point where he can actually help me. Victoria pulled out the chair across from the board. Would you like to play? Lily looked at her, then at the board. Do you want to reset the position or start a new game? New game. Okay. Lily sat down. Do you want white or black? White. Okay. Lily reached out and began resetting the pieces with the quick practice movements of someone who had done it hundreds of times. I should tell you I'm pretty good. Victoria sat down across from her. So am I. The game lasted 43 minutes. Victoria was good. Not casual Friday afternoon good. Actually, structurally good. The kind of player who understood pressure and tempo and didn't make obvious mistakes. She'd learned from her father, who had competed at the amateur level in his 30s, and she'd maintained the habit through college and into her professional life as a way of keeping a certain part of her mind sharp. She had not played against an 8-year-old in approximately 22 years. Lily was different from what Victoria had expected, and Victoria was not usually wrong about expectations. She played quietly, with long pauses that didn't seem to indicate uncertainty so much as calculation. She was looking ahead, further ahead than most adults Victoria had played, and there was something almost meditative about the stillness she dropped into between moves. She didn't fidget, she didn't second-guess herself. She moved with a deliberateness that felt somehow older than she looked. She was also, and this was the part Victoria hadn't anticipated, kind. Not in a sentimental way, but in a practical one. Twice, when Victoria made a move that left an obvious weakness, Lily didn't immediately pounce on it the way a more aggressive player might. She acknowledged it with the slightest tilt of her head and then played something else, something that built pressure elsewhere, giving Victoria's mistake time to compound into something worse rather than just punishing it immediately. It was the chess equivalent of patience, and patience was not a quality Victoria associated with children. Around the 30-minute mark, Victoria's position collapsed. Not dramatically. There was no single catastrophic blunder, no decisive tactical blow. It was more like erosion. Move by move, the space on the board where her pieces could operate had grown smaller and smaller until she looked up from the position and understood, with a clarity that was slightly startling, that there was nothing left to do. She was going to lose. She had been going to lose for probably the last 15 moves. How long ago did you see this? She asked. Lily thought about it. I knew I was probably going to win around here. She touched one of the pieces on her side, her knight on d5, exactly where she'd pointed earlier. But I wasn't sure until about 8 moves ago. Victoria looked at the board. Then she looked at Lily. There was something about the girl's face in that moment. The way she was watching Victoria with a kind of careful attention, checking her reaction, not gloating, not performing, just watching. That hit Victoria somewhere she wasn't expecting, like a door opening into a room she'd thought was sealed. She had thought about it over the years. Of course she had. Not every day and not always in a way she fully acknowledged to herself, but the thought existed, a shape she'd kept in her peripheral vision without looking at it directly. A baby girl. 8 years ago, approximately. She was 30 now. She had been 22 then, and under a pressure she still couldn't fully articulate to someone who hadn't lived inside that particular family, that particular moment. She had made a decision. She had lived with it. She hadn't looked at it directly in years. She looked at Lily Hart. "You're extraordinary," Victoria said. It came out quieter than she intended. Lily looked down at the board. "It's just chess," she said, in a tone that suggested she knew it wasn't, but also that she was slightly uncomfortable being told so directly. "It's not just chess," Victoria paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What do you see when you look at a board? Like, what does it feel like inside, when you're working out a position?" Lily was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to find the right words. "It's like Okay, you know how you're reading a book and you can kind of see what's going to happen a few pages ahead? Not exactly, but the shape of it? Yes, it's like that. Except it's not words, it's like I can feel the tension in the pieces. Like they all have weight, and some of them are pulling on each other, and I can feel which pulls are the important ones. She looked up. Does that make sense? More than you know, Victoria said. Mason came to get Lily 55 minutes after he'd left her. The server room job had been messier than expected. A calibration issue in the secondary cooling unit that had cascaded into something more complicated. The kind of problem that made him slightly angry on behalf of whoever had signed off on the last maintenance check, which had clearly been done inadequately. He'd fixed it, logged it, and come down the hall to find his daughter. He pushed open the conference room door and stopped. Lily was still at the chess table. Across from her, which was not what he had been expecting at any point today, was a woman in a cream blouse who Mason recognized from the company photos on the website. He'd looked them up while he was waiting for parts to arrive, the way he sometimes did, as Victoria Sterling. They were mid-game, a new one from the look of it. Neither of them looked up immediately when he came in, because Lily was studying the board with her usual surgical focus, and Victoria Sterling was watching Lily study the board with an expression Mason couldn't quite name. It wasn't calculating, it was something softer than that, and more complicated, and it made him slightly uneasy in a way he didn't immediately have words for. "Lily," he said. Lily looked up. "Dad, we're in the middle of a game." "I can see that." He looked at Victoria Sterling, who had turned to look at him now with the composed, assessing expression of someone who was very practiced at reading rooms, and people quickly. "I'm sorry. I told her not to touch anything." "She didn't," Victoria said. "She was looking at my board when I came in. We started talking. I invited her to play." A brief pause. "She's won 2 games already." Mason looked at Lily. Lily had the slightly defensive set to her shoulders that meant she wasn't sure if she'd done something wrong. "She's been playing since she was 5, Mason said. "I should warn people." "I'm beginning to understand that." Victoria stood, which changed the geometry of the room. She was taller than she'd looked seated, and carried herself with a stillness that Mason associated with people who had spent a long time not having to prove anything to rooms they walked into. She extended her hand. "Victoria Sterling. Mason Hart." He shook it. "I finished up on 41. We'll get out of your hair." "You don't have to rush," she glanced at Lily. "We were in the middle of something." "We can finish another time," Lily said, which was a sentence Mason had never heard his daughter say about a chess game she was currently winning, and which made him look at her more carefully. Victoria looked at Lily with that expression again, the complicated one, and said, "I'd like that, actually, if your father is comfortable with it." Mason was not immediately comfortable with it. He was tired. He was slightly grimy from the server room. He had another job to get to in the afternoon, and the idea of his daughter having an ongoing chess arrangement with a billionaire corporate executive felt like the kind of thing he should think carefully about before agreeing to. He also knew, looking at Lily's face, that she wanted this, and that she didn't want very many things in the way that other kids her age wanted things. She didn't ask for toys, didn't ask to go to theme parks, didn't push for things that cost money he sometimes didn't have. She wanted books and chess problems and the occasional documentary about ancient history. She wanted to finish this game. "Can I have a word with you?" he said to Victoria. "Outside?" Victoria nodded. They stepped into the corridor, the glass door swinging shut behind them. Mason kept his voice even. "I appreciate that you were kind to her. She's not always comfortable with people she doesn't know, and you made her feel okay, so thank you." "She made herself comfortable," Victoria said. "I didn't do much." "Right." He ran a hand briefly through his hair. "Look, I don't know what your situation is, whether you have kids or... I don't need to know. But Lily gets attached to things. People, when she lets herself. I'm careful about that. So if this is something you genuinely like to do again, I'm open to it. But I'd need to know it's not going to disappear on her. She doesn't do well with things disappearing." Victoria looked at him. The assessing quality in her eyes had shifted into something else, something that was harder to categorize. "It won't disappear," she said. "I don't make commitments I don't intend to keep." He held her gaze for a moment. Okay. Is Thursday possible? Late afternoon? I'm usually free by 4. Thursday was his lightest day. He nodded. Thursday works. They went back inside. Lily was sitting exactly where they'd left her, hands clasped behind her back, studying the board. She looked up when they came in. Well? Thursday, Mason said. Lily's face did the thing it almost never did. It opened briefly and completely into a smile that made her look exactly her age. Then she pulled it back in, the way she always did, and looked at the board and said, in her most casual voice, "Okay, do you want to finish this game, or should we just start fresh on Thursday?" "Let's finish it," Victoria said, sitting back down. "I'd like to see how this ends." Well, Mason sat in a chair against the wall and let them play. He watched Lily. The way she moved, the way she sat, the steady focus that he'd watched develop over 3 years of Saturday morning puzzles and Tuesday night tournaments and one regional competition last fall, where she'd placed second in her age group and cried in the truck afterward. Not because she was upset about losing, but because, as she'd explained to him later, she'd made one mistake in the semifinal and she couldn't stop seeing it. He'd sat with her in the parking lot for 20 minutes until she'd worked it out of her system, and then she'd asked him to take her for ice cream, and by the time they got home, she was already talking about how she was going to fix the mistake next time. That was Lily. She didn't wallow. She processed and moved forward. He watched Victoria Sterling watch Lily. There was something in it that he couldn't quite locate. Not the way an adult watches a talented child. The performative appreciation, the slightly condescending version of being impressed. This was something more careful, more searching, like she was looking for something specific and finding it, and wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. It made him uneasy. He filed the feeling away. The game ended 15 minutes later. Lily won, though from the way Victoria played the last several moves, it was clear she'd understood the position clearly and was looking for something. A particular combination, maybe. Or just the shape of how Lily finished. When the final move landed, Victoria sat back and looked at the board for a long moment. "Well," she said. "It was a good game," Lily said, which was what she always said. "It was." Victoria looked up at her. "You play like someone who thinks chess is a language." Lily tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I mean, most people learn chess as a game, a set of rules, tactics, things to win with. You play like you're saying something, like every move means something beyond just the next move." Lily thought about this seriously, the way she thought about everything seriously. "I think it does mean something," she said. "I think the way you play chess shows how you think, like whether you're patient or impulsive, whether you care more about protecting what you have or going after what you want, whether you're okay with ambiguity or if it makes you panic." "And what does my game say about me?" A pause. "You're really good at controlling space, but sometimes you hold on to your pieces too long because you don't want to trade even when the trade would help you. Like, it's almost like you're afraid of simplifying. You'd rather keep things complicated." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "That's probably fair," she said finally, and her voice had gone slightly flat, the way voices do when something lands closer to the truth than expected. Mason stood up. "We should head out. Lily, say thank you." "Thank you," Lily said, with sincerity rather than obligation. "Thursday," Victoria said. She looked at Mason. 4 o'clock. I'll have Priya put you both on the access list so there's no issue at security." "Appreciated." They rode the elevator down in silence, Lily's backpack on her back, Mason's toolbox at his feet. At the ground floor, as the doors slid open onto the marble lobby, Lily said, "I like her." "Yeah?" "She's not fake," Lily said. "Some adults are fake when they talk to kids, like they're performing being nice. She wasn't doing that." Mason thought about Victoria Sterling's face when she'd watched Lily play, the way that expression had kept shifting, looking for something. "No," he said. "I don't think she was." They walked out into the morning, and the city closed around them, and Mason told himself the uneasy feeling was nothing, just the leftover tension of a difficult job and a disrupted morning, and that by Thursday he'd have figured out why something about the whole thing felt like it was moving in a direction he couldn't quite see yet. He didn't figure it out, but he remembered the feeling, Thursday came faster than Mason expected, which wasn't unusual. The weeks had a way of compressing when he was busy. And he was always busy. He picked Lily up from school at 3:15, drove downtown through the kind of afternoon traffic that required patience he didn't always have, and pulled into the parking structure beside the Crestfield building at 3:52. Lily had been quiet most of the drive, which meant she was thinking. "You nervous?" he asked, cutting the engine. "No." A pause. "Maybe a little." "About what?" She thought about it. "What if I played better last time than I actually am? Like, what if it was just a good day and now she'll see that I'm not actually that good?" Mason looked at her. "You beat her twice." "She's very good." "Lily, you beat her twice." She pulled at the zipper on her jacket. "What if she's been practicing since Monday? Then it'll be a better game." "That's not reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be reassuring. It was meant to be accurate." He got out of the truck. "Come on, you're the one who wanted to come back." Priya at the reception desk recognized them this time, which made the whole process take about 30 seconds instead of 10 minutes. She handed them badges without being asked and told them Victoria was expecting them in the same conference room. Lily walked to the elevator with her hands in her jacket pockets, which was her version of projecting calm. Victoria was already in the conference room when they arrived. She'd reset the chessboard, fresh game, pieces in their starting positions, and there was a glass of water on the table for Lily and a cup of coffee on her side that she'd clearly been working through before they arrived. She stood when they came in, and Mason noticed she'd traded the wool trousers for something slightly less formal, dark jeans and a simple gray top, which he suspected was a deliberate gesture he probably wasn't supposed to read too much into. "You came back," she said to Lily. "I said I would," Lily said, with the faint reproach of someone who took stated intentions seriously. "Fair enough." Victoria gestured at the chair across from her. "Shall we?" Mason settled into the chair against the wall. It was already his chair, in the way that a seat becomes yours after you've occupied it once. He had his phone out, but he wasn't really looking at it. They played for 2 hours. Not one game, 4. Victoria won the second one, a tight positional match that Lily seemed to learn from in real time, adjusting between games in ways that Mason could see even without fully understanding them. After the third game, which Lily won in 51 moves with a quiet precision that Victoria acknowledged by simply sitting back and saying, "I walked right into that." They took a break and Lily drank her water, and Victoria refilled her coffee from a small carafe someone had brought in at some point, and for a few minutes, nobody talked about chess. "Do you have a coach?" Victoria asked. "Sort of," Lily said. "There's a guy at the community center who runs a chess club. Mr. Petrov. He's good, but I think I've gotten past where he can, I don't know. He says I should find someone better, but we haven't figured out how to do that yet." "What would that take? Finding someone better?" Lily looked at Mason. Mason set his phone down. "The serious coaches are expensive," he said. "There are a couple of junior programs in the city, one affiliated with the Chess Association, one at Harwick Academy, but both of them have waiting lists, and the better one has a fee structure that's, He stopped. "It's more than we can manage right now." He said it plainly, without apology. He'd learned years ago that apologizing for financial reality just made conversations about it more awkward for everyone, and he didn't particularly want this conversation to be awkward. Victoria nodded, also without making it awkward. "She should be playing in more tournaments. We do local ones. She should be doing regionals. She placed second in her age group last fall, you said." Lily looked at him. "You told her that?" "While you were mid-game, she asked about your record. I lost in the semifinal because I misplayed a rook endgame that I should have." "Lily," Mason said. I know. She looked at Victoria. "I made a mistake. I fixed it in my head afterward. I don't think I'll make the same one again." "What was the mistake?" And they were off again. Lily describing the position from memory, Victoria asking follow-up questions, the two of them operating in a frequency that left Mason mostly in spectator mode, which was fine. He was used to watching Lily be extraordinary in situations where he couldn't quite follow her. He'd made his peace with that early on. His job wasn't to keep up with her, it was to make sure she had somewhere to stand while she figured out how far she could go. What he watched more carefully this week and the weeks that followed was Victoria, because they came back. Thursday became a standing thing, not formally declared, just gradually established the way certain things are, through repetition and the absence of anyone suggesting it should stop. The third Thursday, Lily brought a book of Capablanca's games, and Victoria already had a copy of the same book on the table when they arrived, and Mason had a brief, disorienting moment of understanding that these two had been in communication through Priya about what to bring, which meant the arrangement had taken on a logistics infrastructure he hadn't been consulted about. He wasn't annoyed. He thought about being annoyed briefly, and then didn't. The fourth Thursday, Victoria's actual work schedule had apparently collided with their 4 o'clock window, and her assistant sent a message that she'd be 30 minutes late. They waited in the conference room, Lily working on a puzzle book, Mason staring out the window at the city 41 floors below. When Victoria finally came in, she was still in what looked like a meeting's aftermath, slightly tighter around the eyes, the composed surface intact but sitting differently, something underneath it that had been compressed and hadn't fully released yet. She sat down, looked at the board, and said, "Sorry, difficult afternoon." "What happened?" Lily asked. A pause. Victoria looked at her. "Board issue. Someone I've worked with for a long time decided that a decision I made last quarter was the wrong one and spent 40 minutes this afternoon explaining why in front of 6 other people. Were they right?" Another pause. This one slightly longer, and Mason found himself paying close attention. "Partially," Victoria said. "The decision had a flaw I hadn't anticipated. I knew about it afterward, but I'd already committed, so I adjusted and managed the outcome. He was right about the flaw. He was wrong about what it meant." She picked up a pawn and set it back down. "He's been doing that for 2 years, waiting for something he can use." "Why?" "Because he wanted the job I have and didn't get it, and decided that was my fault." Lily considered this. "That seems like a waste of his energy." Victoria looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled. Not the polished version Mason had seen her use in the building, the one that was part of a professional vocabulary, but something smaller and more genuine. "It is a waste of his energy," she said. "I'll try to remember that." "You already knew it," Lily said. "You just needed someone to say it back." Mason watched Victoria absorb that, the way people absorb something accurate that comes from an unexpected direction, with a very brief stillness and then a small realignment. "How old are you again?" Victoria asked. 8.5, Lily said, reaching out to move her first piece. "Your turn." The fifth Thursday, it rained. Mason had been dealing with a difficult week, a job that had gone over schedule, a bill that had come in higher than anticipated, a conversation with Lily's teacher about an incident at school that wasn't serious but had required 2 phone calls, and an afternoon of careful talking to Lily about why you didn't correct your classmates in front of the whole class, even if they were wrong, especially when they were wrong about something they clearly cared about. The teacher had used the word isolated in a context that made Mason's chest tighten, and he'd sat with that word for 2 days before deciding he needed to not catastrophize and instead just keep an eye on things. He was tired by Thursday, more tired than he usually let himself acknowledge. They arrived at the Crestfield building at 4 and rode the elevator up and found the conference room, and Victoria was there with the board set up, and also, unexpectedly, a plate of food on the credenza. Sandwiches, cut into quarters, the kind of thing you'd order for a working lunch. Mason stopped in the doorway. "I had my assistant order extra from a meeting we had this afternoon," Victoria said, which was probably true but also clearly not the whole reason. "I thought you might be hungry." Lily was already across the room looking at the board. Mason looked at the sandwiches. He was hungry. He'd skipped lunch because the morning job had run long. "Thank you," he said, and sat down and ate, and let himself be taken care of for 20 minutes without making it complicated, which was harder than it sounded because he'd been doing everything himself for long enough that being offered anything, even a plate of leftover sandwiches, activated a reflex he had to consciously override. Lily and Victoria played. Mason ate and watched the rain against the window and felt, slowly and without entirely meaning to, the tightness in his chest begin to ease. It was around the 6th week that he started paying attention to the way Victoria was with Lily in a different way than before. Not suspicious. He'd passed through suspicious and arrived somewhere more neutral, more curious. Victoria was careful with Lily, not in the way adults were careful with fragile things, but in the way you're careful with something that matters, attentive, consistent, genuinely interested. She remembered things Lily said from one Thursday to the next. She asked follow-up questions about the chess club, about Mr. Petrov, about a book Lily had mentioned offhandedly 2 weeks earlier. She asked once, in a quiet moment when Lily had gone to use the restroom, "Does she have friends? At school?" Mason thought about the word isolated from Lily's teacher. A couple. She's not like other kids her age. She knows it, they know it. She doesn't have great instincts for pretending to care about things she doesn't care about, so the social stuff it's a work in progress. That doesn't change, Victoria said. Necessarily, he looked at her. Speaking from experience? A pause. I was a strange kid. Good at certain things, bad at others. The being different part doesn't go away. You get better at deciding which rooms to care about. Lily hasn't figured that part out yet. She will. She said it with a certainty that was slightly more than confident, slightly more than optimistic. The kind of certainty that's attached to something real. She knows her own mind. That's the hard part. The social mechanics are learnable. Mason was quiet for a moment. How'd you figure it out, the room to care about part? Victoria looked at the board. Badly. And late. And after making some decisions, I'd go back and change if I could. She picked up her queen and set it down in exactly the same square. But I figured it out. Lily came back from the restroom and climbed into her chair, and the conversation folded itself away, the way those conversations do, leaving no obvious trace. But Mason kept it. The shift, when it came, was gradual enough that he almost missed it. He started noticing it around week 7 or 8. He'd lost exact count, because the Thursdays had become part of the week's structure the way recurring things do, weightless until you try to imagine removing them. Victoria had started arriving to their sessions differently than she had in the first few weeks. Less compressed. The tight around the eyes quality that had been her default was still there sometimes, still surfaced when she'd come straight from a difficult meeting or a phone call that had clearly gone badly. But it arrived less, and when it did, it eased faster. He noticed it most clearly one Thursday in late October when he came in from the parking structure damp from an unexpected rain shower, Lily running ahead of him into the lobby, and found Victoria already in the conference room, not in front of the chessboard, but sitting at the table with her laptop open and reading glasses on. Reading glasses he hadn't known she wore, which for some reason struck him as specific and human in a way he hadn't anticipated. And she looked up when they came in and her face did something immediate and uncalculated, a loosening that happened before she had time to manage it. She was glad to see them. Not in the polished way she was glad to see people in the hallways of this building, the composed professional gladness that was part of the job. Just glad. The same way he was glad when a long day ended and Lily was already in her pajamas and had saved him the last of the leftovers from dinner. He sat down in his chair against the wall and pretended to look at his phone and thought carefully about what he was observing. He did not think Victoria Sterling had any motives he needed to be worried about. He'd assessed that early and revisited it several times and arrived at the same conclusion each time. She wasn't interested in Lily as a project or a curiosity. She wasn't performing generosity for an audience. Whatever was happening when she looked at Lily, it was internal. It belonged to her, not to any external purpose. But it was something. He just didn't know what yet. One Thursday in November, Lily asked Victoria if she had any kids. She asked it the way she asked most questions, which was directly and without particular preamble, during a pause between games when she was resetting the pieces. Victoria had been looking out the window. The question landed, and she turned back, and there was a beat. Short, barely perceptible, but Mason caught it, before she answered. "No," she said. Lily nodded, accepting this at face value, and went back to resetting the board. "Do you want kids?" "Lily," Mason said. "It's fine," Victoria said. She looked at Lily. "I don't know. I think there was a time when I thought I'd figure that out later. And later came and went, and I still haven't figured it out." "My dad didn't plan to have me," Lily said, in a tone that was completely matter-of-fact. "He told me that. He said it was the best unplanned thing that ever happened to him." Mason felt his face heat slightly. "I said something like that, in a more private context. You said exactly that, Lily said, with the specificity of someone who kept a mental archive of exact things people had said. Victoria looked at Mason, briefly, and he had no idea what his face was doing and couldn't quite manage it. That's a good thing to be, she said. The best unplanned thing. She said it lightly, but there was something underneath it that wasn't light at all. Mason heard it. He thought, looking at her, that she probably didn't intend for him to hear it, and so he looked back down at his phone and didn't acknowledge it. The call about the tournament came on a Wednesday morning in early December. Mason was under a sink in an office building in the financial district when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He ignored it again. When he got out from under the sink to get a different wrench, he had 3 missed calls from the same number and a voicemail, which was enough to make him actually listen to it. The message was from someone named Dr. Everett Walsh, Director of Youth Programs at the National Junior Chess Federation. He spoke carefully and precisely, in the tone of someone delivering information he expected to be surprising. He was calling, he said, because Lily Hart had come to their attention through a combination of her regional results and, as he understood it, some informal recommendations from people who had observed her play. He was calling to discuss whether Lily might be eligible to receive an at-large invitation to the National Junior Open, the most prestigious youth chess tournament in the country, to be held in March. The invitation was not guaranteed, he said. There was a review process, but they wanted to discuss it. Mason listened to the message twice. Then he sat on the floor of the office building hallway and stared at the wall for about 90 seconds. He called Dr. Walsh back from the parking lot. The conversation lasted 22 minutes and left him with a lot of information and one central question. Who had flagged Lily's name to the National Junior Chess Federation? The answer, when he asked Priya at the Crestfield building the following Thursday before he and Lily went up to 41, came back as he'd partly suspected it would. Victoria Sterling had made a phone call. She had made it, according to Priya, who clearly wasn't sure how much she should be sharing, and was sharing it anyway because she seemed to have formed her own opinion about whether Mason ought to know, about 3 weeks ago. She had called someone she knew on the Federation's advisory board and described Lily's play in enough detail that the person had apparently agreed the girl needed to be seen by someone qualified to evaluate her. Mason rode the elevator to 41 and walked down the corridor to the conference room and opened the door. Victoria and Lily were already mid-game. Dr. Walsh called, Mason said from the doorway. Victoria set down the piece she'd been holding. Lily looked up. Who's Dr. Walsh? Lily asked. National Junior Chess Federation, Mason said. He looked at Victoria. You want to tell her, or should I? Victoria looked at Lily. There's a tournament in March. It's the most important junior chess tournament in the country. I think you should be in it. Lily stared at her. The National Junior Open? You know it? Of course I know it. Lily's voice had gone slightly high. Mr. Petrov talks about it. He says it's, you have to qualify or get invited. How would I? You were recommended, Mason said, for an at-large invitation. They want to evaluate you first, but Dr. Walsh seems to think the evaluation is a formality. Lily looked at the board, then at Victoria, then at Mason. You did this, she said to Victoria. I made a phone call, Victoria said. Why? Victoria looked at her with that direct steadiness she'd used since the first day, the thing that made Lily trust her. Because you're the best player I've seen at your level, and you're not getting the exposure you should be getting, and I know people who can fix that, so I fixed it. Lily was quiet for a moment. Mason watched his daughter's face work through something complicated. Gratitude and surprise, and the slight discomfort of being helped in a way you hadn't asked for, which was a feeling he recognized because he felt it himself fairly often. You should have asked me first, Lily said. Victoria blinked. Whatever she'd been expecting, that wasn't it. You're right, she said after a second. I should have. I would have said yes, Lily added, but you should have asked. You're right, Victoria said again, and this time there was something in it that wasn't just acknowledgement, something that looked, to Mason, like a woman being corrected in a way she wasn't used to and finding it unexpectedly not bad. Okay, Lily said. She looked at the board. We need to practice harder. I know, Victoria said. Like, actually harder. Not just Thursday games. I need to work on my endgames and my time management under pressure, and I need to play against people who are better than me more often. I can arrange that. I'm not bad, Lily said quickly. I just want to be better. I know you're not bad. Victoria's voice had gone quiet in a particular way. I know exactly how good you are. Mason sat down in his chair against the wall. Lily was already turning back to the board, firing off questions about tournament formats and preparation strategies. And Victoria was answering with the focused specificity of someone who had been thinking about this for weeks, who had clearly planned for this conversation and was having it exactly as she'd anticipated. He watched the two of them and tried to name what he was feeling, and the best he could do was something in the territory of wondering, a low, patient, not entirely comfortable curiosity about where exactly this road went and what was waiting at the end of it. He didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure Victoria did either. But Lily was leaning over the board, eyes bright, already somewhere ahead of both of them. And for the moment, that was enough to watch. December gave way to January. The sessions shifted, more structured now, more purposeful, oriented toward the tournament in March. Victoria brought in a retired tournament player named Gerald Osei twice a month to work specific weaknesses with Lily, a slight hesitancy in converting winning rook endgames, a tendency under time pressure to choose the familiar move over the better one. Gerald was a compact, precise man in his 60s who said very little that wasn't about chess and who, after the first session, told Victoria in a voice Mason could just barely hear that the child was genuinely unusual and that he'd worked with perhaps two others like her in 30 years of coaching. Mason heard this and did the thing he'd trained himself to do, which was to set it carefully to one side, because Lily being unusual was something he already knew and had learned to handle with a particular kind of balance, proud enough to fight for her, grounded enough not to build a mythology around her that she'd have to carry. What he watched, more than Lily's improvement, was Victoria. She was investing, not just money and time, she was investing attention in a way that cost something, in the way that real attention always costs something. She read the tournament rule books. She asked Gerald pointed questions about Lily's specific vulnerabilities. She cleared her Thursday afternoons with a consistency that Mason knew, from things Priya had mentioned, required real scheduling work, because Victoria's schedule was not an easy thing to rearrange. She also, increasingly, let herself be present in a way that wasn't about chess at all. She and Lily had started having conversations that Mason only half followed, about history, about the mechanics of how decisions get made by people in power, about what Lily might want to do when she grew up, which was a question Lily answered differently every time. Most recently, maybe something with math, but I don't know what kind yet. Victoria listened to each answer with the same seriousness, never treating any of them as more or less valid than the others, which was the correct approach, and also, Mason thought, the approach of someone who remembered what it felt like to not know yet. One Thursday in late January, he came back from using the restroom. He'd started leaving the room occasionally, testing something he couldn't quite articulate, and found Lily sitting not across from Victoria, but beside her, both of them looking at something on Victoria's laptop. He paused in the doorway. Victoria had pulled up an online database of classic games, and Lily was pointing at something on the screen and talking, and Victoria was leaning slightly toward her, following the cursor with her eyes, and the geometry of the two of them, the angle of their heads, something about the particular quality of the quiet between words, stopped Mason completely. He stood there for 2 seconds. Then he walked back in and sat down and looked at his phone and made himself breathe normally. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say because he didn't know yet what he was seeing. He just filed it with the other things he'd filed. The complicated expression from the first day, the carefully placed sandwiches, the phone call to the Federation, the way Victoria had said, "I know exactly how good you are," with her voice doing that particular thing. It was January. The tournament was in March. He had the feeling, the way you have a feeling before a storm when the air pressure changes, that something was building, that the Thursdays were not the thing. The Thursdays were the before. The after was coming, and it was going to be something he wasn't fully prepared for. And all he could do was make sure that whatever it was, Lily came through it okay. That was the job. That had always been the job. He looked up from his phone. Victoria was explaining something to Lily about a particular endgame technique, and Lily was nodding slowly, and both of them were exactly where they were supposed to be. In this room, on this Thursday, in the middle of an ordinary evening that felt quietly like the last of something. February came in cold and relentless, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself dramatically, but just settled in and stayed, working its way into the edges of things. Mason noticed it in the mornings when he started his truck, the engine turning over slower than it should, the heater taking longer to catch. He noticed it in the way the city moved, everyone slightly contracted, shoulders up, looking at the ground. He noticed it in himself, a low-grade weariness he couldn't fully attribute to any single cause. The tournament was 6 weeks out. Lily had entered a different mode. She'd always been focused, but this was something more concentrated, a narrowing of attention that Mason recognized from the months before her regional competition and knew better than to interrupt unnecessarily. She was working through games in the evenings after dinner, a small notebook beside her where she wrote down positions and variations in a handwriting that was neater than her schoolwork, as though the subject matter deserved more care. She'd stopped watching the Saturday morning documentaries she usually liked. She went to bed on time without being asked. She woke up asking about specific opening lines the way other kids might wake up thinking about what was for breakfast. Gerald Osei came twice in February instead of once, sessions that lasted 2 hours each and left Lily tired in the particular way that real mental work leaves you tired. Not unhappy, just emptied out and needing to refill. Mason sat through both of them, watching Gerald's approach, which was methodical and slightly severe and exactly what Lily needed. Gerald didn't soften corrections. He said, "That was wrong," without patting it, and then explained why. And Lily absorbed it with a seriousness that impressed even Gerald, who Mason had gathered was not easily impressed. Victoria attended both sessions. She didn't insert herself into the coaching. She sat to the side, watching, occasionally making a note on her phone, asking Gerald 1 or 2 questions afterward that suggested she'd been paying close attention. She'd cleared both afternoons from what Mason understood was a schedule that genuinely didn't have slack in it. He appreciated that. He didn't say so, because he was still calibrating how much to say and about what, but he appreciated it. What he noticed in February was that something had shifted in the way Victoria moved through the conference room. The first weeks, she'd inhabited the space with the precise ease of someone in her own territory, relaxed in the way that control relaxes you, everything familiar, everything where she expected it. Now there was something different in her stillness, less ease, more effort. The composed surface was intact, but underneath it something was working, something that required maintenance in a way it hadn't before. He noticed it most clearly the Thursday after Valentine's Day, which was a date that didn't mean anything particular to Mason. He'd bought Lily a small box of chocolates, and they'd watched a movie, and that was as far as Valentine's Day went in their household, but which seemed to have arrived for Victoria with some weight attached. She was quieter than usual. She let Lily lead more of the conversation. At one point, mid-game, Lily asked her something about a knight maneuver, and Victoria answered correctly, but her eyes didn't move from the board in the way they usually did when she was tracking the position. She was somewhere else, briefly, and then she came back. After Lily went to the restroom, Mason said, "You okay?" Victoria looked up. "Yes?" A pause. "Why?" "You've been somewhere else for about an hour." She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how much of a conversation to have. "Bad week," she said finally. "Some things I've been managing came to a head at the same time." "The board issue? From a few months ago?" "Partly." She set down her coffee. "And some other things, personal things." He waited. He'd learned that waiting was usually more productive than asking. "Do you ever—" She stopped, started again. "Do you ever have something that you managed to put away and you thought you'd put it away properly, and then something happens that makes you realize you just moved it to a room you weren't going in, and the room was always there?" Mason thought about this. He thought about a specific night about 4 years ago when he'd found a photograph while cleaning out a closet. Lily's mother, before things had gone wrong, before she'd left, before all of it, and had stood holding it in the kitchen for a long time while Lily slept 20 feet away, and had felt the full weight of every decision that had led to that moment sitting on his chest like a physical thing. He'd put the photograph in an envelope, and put the envelope in a box, and put the box in the back of the highest shelf in his closet. The room was still there. He just didn't open it often. "Yeah," he said. "I know that." Victoria looked at him. Something in her face adjusted. Just slightly. The way things adjust when you've expected to be alone with something and someone unexpectedly demonstrates that they understand it. Lily came back and the conversation ended, and the game resumed and they drove home in the usual dark, Lily quiet and tired in the passenger seat, and Mason thought about what Victoria had said the whole drive home, and into the evening, and even briefly, when he woke at 3 in the morning the way he sometimes did, and lay in the dark listening to the building settle. The room was always there. He didn't know yet what room she meant. He thought he probably should find out. The DNA test was not something Victoria had planned. She had thought about it. She'd be lying to herself if she claimed the thought hadn't surfaced, because it had, more than once, in the particular way that thoughts surface when you've tried to keep them submerged. But thinking about something and doing something are separated by a distance that can be very large or very small, depending on which direction you're moving. And for months the distance had felt uncrossable. What crossed it was a photograph. It was a Friday in the second week of February. Not a Thursday, not a session day, just a regular work day. Victoria had a meeting that ran long and came back to her office afterward to find a stack of folders on her desk that her assistant had left. One of them was a file she'd requested on a minor legal matter, and on top of the file was a printout, a financial summary with a photograph clipped to it, a standard document photo of someone she was evaluating for a board position. The man in the photograph had a daughter, apparently. The biographical sheet mentioned her. A brief line, the way biographical sheets sometimes mentioned family. And someone in her office, trying to be thorough, had included a small snapshot from the man's company website where he was photographed at an event with his family. The daughter in the photograph was 11 or 12, dark-haired, looking slightly sideways at the camera with the particular expression of a child who was paying attention to something beyond the frame. Victoria looked at the photograph for about 10 seconds. Then she opened her desk drawer and took out the card for a medical testing facility she'd been carrying for 3 months. The process was simple and terrible in its simplicity. She requested a sample collection kit through a private facility, which handled everything discreetly and without particular comment, because discretion was part of what you paid for at the level of privacy she required. The hard part was the sample. She needed something biological from Lily without Lily knowing, which meant without Mason knowing, which meant doing something she spent 3 days turning over before she did it. The Thursday session in late February, Lily had a glass of water, as usual. After she left, after Mason walked her out and came back for his jacket he'd left on the chair, the glass was still on the table. The room was empty for 40 seconds. Victoria stood at the table for those 40 seconds. Then she did what she'd been debating for 3 days, and then she sat down and looked at the chessboard for a long time without seeing it. She told herself she had a right to know. She told herself that knowing didn't obligate her to do anything. She told herself that if the test came back negative, which it very well might, because she had been down this road in her mind before, the pattern-matching road, where you see a resemblance and your mind builds a case for it that your emotions then endorse, she would close the room permanently this time with better locks. She told herself a lot of things. They were all true, and none of them made her feel better. The results took 12 days. During those 12 days, Victoria went to work and ran her company and sat in meetings and made decisions and returned calls and did every visible thing she normally did with the competence she'd spent years building. Internally, she was doing something else entirely. She was running 2 parallel lives in her mind. The one where the test came back negative and she breathed out and found a way to explain to herself why this had happened and then went forward with Lily as what they were, which was a genuine friendship, unusual and good, between a child and an adult who didn't have anything else connecting them. And the one where it came back positive, which she could not run to its end no matter how many times she tried, because it kept stopping at the same point. A gray hospital room 8 years ago, a decision made under a pressure that had felt, at 22, like the only possible choice. Her mother's voice, her father's silence, which had been louder, a form signed, a room left. She had been 22. She had been alone in a way that wealth does not prevent, and sometimes makes worse. She had made a decision that she had carried without telling anyone. Not really, not in a way that involved actual words spoken to actual people, for 8 years. She had built something with those 8 years. A company, a reputation, a life of deliberate construction. She did not regret the construction. She occasionally sat with the question of whether she regretted the decision that had made it possible, and the answer was never clean. You can't regret what you can't fully reconstruct. You can only live alongside it. The results arrived by encrypted email on a Thursday morning, 2 hours before the session. Victoria sat in her office and opened the email. She read the results. She read them again. Then she closed her laptop and sat very still for a long time. And the city moved outside her window and the building made its sounds around her, and she sat in it like someone who had been handed something too heavy to immediately lift and was deciding where to set it down. The probability was 99.7%. Lily Hart was her biological daughter. Wos. She went to the session. She almost didn't. She sat in her office at 3:45 and seriously considered calling Priya and having her send a message, family emergency, something vague, and taking the night to think. She got as far as reaching for her phone, then she put it back down. Because Lily would be in that conference room at 4 o'clock. Lily, who had been preparing for 6 weeks, who had a specific endgame she wanted to work through, who had mentioned on Tuesday, Victoria knew this because she'd been corresponding with Priya about session materials, and Priya had passed along a note, that she'd found something interesting in a Karpov game she wanted to show Victoria. Victoria went to the session. She sat across from Lily, and they played chess, and Victoria made 3 mistakes in the first 20 minutes that she would not normally have made. Errors of attention, her mind pulling away from the board and having to be dragged back. Gerald wasn't there that day. Just the 3 of them, the usual geometry, Lily and Victoria at the board, and Mason against the wall with his phone. After the second obvious mistake, Lily looked up at her. "What's wrong with you today?" Victoria blinked. "Nothing." "You're not playing right." Lily studied her face with the directness she brought to everything. "You have the same look you had in February, the room look." Mason looked up from his phone. "I'm fine," Victoria said. I have a lot on my mind today. Work things." Lily looked at her for another second. Then she looked at the board. "Do you want to stop?" "No." Victoria moved a piece. The right one this time. She was paying attention again. She could do this. "Let's keep going." They kept going. It was objectively not a good session. Lily was patient with her but increasingly puzzled, and Mason was watching in a way that was different from his usual watching, more calibrated, the way he watched when he thought something was off. Victoria played to the end of the game, said the right things, asked the right questions about preparation. She sounded, she thought, almost like herself. When they stood to leave, Lily put on her jacket and then, without any particular preamble, walked around the table and put her arms around Victoria's waist. She'd done it once before, about a month ago, a brief hug at the end of a session, offered and received naturally, without ceremony. This time it lasted a little longer. Lily's chin came up to about Victoria's collarbone, and she pressed her face briefly against her shoulder before stepping back. "You'll feel better," Lily said. "You always do." Victoria stood very still. She was holding herself together with what felt like a very thin internal structure, the way a building looks solid from the outside when the actual load-bearing work is happening invisibly inside. "Yeah," she said, "I will." Mason was watching from the doorway. He said nothing. He had that look, the one she'd seen before, the filing look, where he was putting something into a category and keeping it. They left. Victoria stood in the empty conference room and looked at the chessboard for a long time after their footsteps had disappeared down the corridor. She spent 2 weeks turning over the question of what to do, and it was the worst 2 weeks she'd had in years. Not because she didn't know what the right thing was. She did know, or she thought she did. The right thing was to tell them, obviously, because the alternative was to continue this relationship while knowing what she knew, which was a kind of deception she didn't think she could sustain and didn't think she deserved to sustain. She had made one decision 8 years ago in conditions that she could explain and partially defend. Making a second one now, with more information and more agency, was different. That one would be harder to live with. But knowing the right thing and doing it are separated by the same distance as thinking about something and doing it, and what lay in between in this case was not small. There was Lily, an 8-year-old who had a father who was her entire world, who had never been told she was adopted, who was 6 weeks away from the most important chess tournament of her short life, and was in the concentrated preparation phase that Mason was clearly protective of, and which Victoria had spent 3 months helping to build. Telling Lily the truth before the tournament meant detonating something in the middle of everything she'd been working toward. There was Mason, a man who had raised this child alone for 8 years, who had made every sacrifice, absorbed every difficulty, built a life around this person in a way that Victoria, watching it from the outside over 4 months, understood was not partial or circumstantial, but total. Mason Hart had given everything he had to Lily, and everything he had was not a small thing. He was not a dramatic person. He did not perform his love. He just did it, day after day, in the concrete ways that love actually manifests. The double-knotted shoelaces, the carefully calibrated conversations about social difficulty, the plate of cafeteria leftovers eaten in a chair against a wall so his daughter could do something that mattered to her. If Victoria walked into that conference room and said what she knew, she was going to put a fault line through something that Mason Hart had built with his hands. She told herself she had to do it anyway. She told herself she could wait until after the tournament. She told herself the tournament was only 6 weeks away. She told herself Lily deserved to know. She told herself Lily also deserved to not have her focus shattered in the most important preparation window of her chess life. She went in circles for 2 weeks, and at the end of 2 weeks she was no closer to a decision except that she was more tired and the carrying of it had gotten heavier. And on a Sunday night in early March, she sat alone in her apartment with a glass of wine she didn't drink and looked out at the city and understood clearly and without the ability to argue herself out of it that she could not do this alone anymore. She needed to tell Mason first. She called him on a Monday. She called his cell phone, which she had in her contacts from the Priya-mediated logistics of the past months. He answered on the 3rd ring, slightly out of breath. She'd caught him in the middle of something. "It's Victoria," she said. A brief pause. "Hey, is everything okay? Is it about Thursday?" "No, Thursday is fine." She was standing at her office window. The city was gray and cold and far below. "I need to meet with you, without Lily, this week if possible." Another pause. "What's this about?" "I'd rather talk in person." "Victoria." His voice had shifted. "You're kind of scaring me. Just tell me if Lily is in some kind of trouble or—" "Lily isn't in trouble. She's fine. She's wonderful." The words came out with a feeling she hadn't intended to put into them, and she stopped and pressed them back down. I need to talk to you about something, and I can't do it over the phone. Can you meet me tomorrow? I can come to you, wherever is easiest." A long pause. "There's a diner on Mercer Street, Callaway's. I drive past it every morning." "What time?" 7:30, before I start work." "I'll be there." "What?" Callaway's was the kind of diner that had been in the same spot for 30 years and looked it. Worn counter, booths with slightly sticky laminate menus, coffee that arrived in thick ceramic cups before you asked for it. Victoria arrived at 7:25 and sat in a booth near the back, which was the right instinct for a conversation like this. The waitress brought coffee. Victoria wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the door. Mason came in at 7:29. He was in work clothes. The blue shirt, the jacket that had a small tear at the left elbow she'd noticed before, and he looked like someone who had not slept particularly well. He saw her, came to the booth, slid in across from her, and accepted the coffee the waitress poured without looking away from Victoria. "Okay," he said. She had planned what to say. She'd planned it 3 times, in 3 different ways, and all 3 versions had fallen apart somewhere in the middle when she'd tried to rehearse them. So she'd stopped rehearsing and decided to say what was true in the most direct order. "I owe you something," she said. "I owe you an apology first for doing something without your knowledge that I should have talked to you about." He was very still. "About 3 weeks ago I had a DNA test done. On Lily." She watched it land. She watched his face go through several things very quickly. Confusion, the beginning of a question, the question dissolving into something else as the implications caught up. "What?" His voice was quiet and very flat. I used a sample from a glass she used during a session. Without her knowledge and without yours. I know that was wrong. I knew it when I did it, and I did it anyway, and I am telling you now because you deserve to know, and because I cannot have this conversation otherwise. He was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not anger, not yet. Something more stunned than angry. Something that had gone very internal, very fast. Why? He said. It wasn't really a question, or it was, but not about the mechanics. Because I had a daughter, Victoria said. 8 years ago. I was 22. I was in a situation that, it doesn't matter, I made a decision to give her up through a private agency. I was told the process was closed. I wasn't supposed to know anything. I wasn't supposed to be in the same room. She stopped. And then I met Lily, and I told myself I was wrong. I told myself I was making a pattern out of something that wasn't there. I told myself it was nothing. A pause. I needed to know. Mason's hands were flat on the table. He was breathing with a deliberateness that she recognized as effort. The test, he said. What did it? 99.7%. He didn't say anything for a moment. The diner moved around them. Other booths, other people, coffee cups, and morning noise that had nothing to do with anything. She doesn't know, Victoria said. I haven't told her. I came to you first. I want you to understand that whatever happens, whatever you decide, I'm not going to walk into her life and blow it apart. I'm not going to... Stop! His voice cracked slightly on the word. He pressed one hand briefly over his face and then lowered it. His eyes were red at the edges. Just stop talking for a second. She stopped. He sat there. She watched him absorb something that there was no easy way to absorb. Something that was changing the shape of everything he knew to be true, and she did not look away because looking away felt like the wrong kind of cowardice. After a long moment, he said, She's going to need to know. I know. Not now. He looked up. His face had settled into something, not calm exactly, but deliberate. Not before the tournament. She's been working for months and she's ready, and I am not going to... She doesn't get to have that taken from her. Whatever else happens, she gets to have that. Victoria felt something release in her chest. Yes, after the tournament. And I tell her. His voice was steady now, the way something is steady when it's found the thing it will not move on. Not alone, I'm not going to blindside her alone, but I need to be there. I need to be the one. You'll be there, Victoria said. I wouldn't do it any other way. He looked at her for a long moment. She thought he might be angry. He had every right to be, and she was ready for it. But what she saw instead was something more complicated and more painful than anger. It was the face of a person doing the hardest arithmetic of their life. I have a question, he said. Okay. Why did you come back? To the sessions. Once you started, once you had the thought that she might be, why did you keep coming back and letting her get attached? It was the right question. It was the exact right question, and she had known it was coming. Because I didn't know for certain, she said, and because even before I knew, it was already real. What we were building, and she stopped. I was selfish. I wanted the time. I knew it might cost something, and I took it anyway. She looked at him directly. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix it. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said finally. It doesn't. A pause. But I appreciate that you're saying it. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The diner went on around them. Outside the window, the city was doing its morning thing, indifferent and continuous, and the two of them sat in the booth with the weight of what had just been said between them and made no movement to pick it up yet. There was time, Mason thought. Not much, but some. The tournament was 3 weeks out, 3 weeks to carry this. 3 weeks for both of them to figure out how you tell a child something that was going to change everything she thought she knew about herself, and do it in a way that left her whole. He looked at Victoria across the table. He thought about her at 22, alone in a way that wealth makes its own specific kind of alone. He thought about the room she'd mentioned, the one that had always been there. He thought about Lily with her arms around Victoria's waist, face pressed briefly into her shoulder. You'll feel better, you always do. He didn't forgive it yet. He wasn't sure he was supposed to. But he looked at Victoria Sterling sitting across from him in a diner on Mercer Street with her coffee going cold and her composure doing the hard, visible work of staying in one piece. And he thought that whatever she was not someone who had made peace with what she'd done. She was someone who had lived alongside it for 8 years and was finally, imperfectly, looking at it directly. That wasn't nothing. 3 weeks, he said. Victoria nodded. 3 weeks. The 3 weeks between the diner and the tournament were the strangest of Mason's adult life. He went to work. He came home. He made dinner, helped Lily with homework that had nothing to do with chess, watched her work through problems at the kitchen table with the focused economy of motion she brought to everything that mattered to her. He drove her to a session with Gerald on a Saturday morning and sat in the corner and watched a 60-year-old man work patiently through rook endgames with his daughter and felt the specific, exhausting weight of knowing something that the two people in front of him did not know. He kept it. That was the agreement, and he honored it, because Mason Hart was someone who honored agreements even when honoring them cost him something. And this one cost him sleep and appetite and a low-level ability to be fully present in any given moment. He woke at odd hours and lay in the dark, doing the arithmetic Victoria had accused herself of not finishing. Running forward from the diner conversation to the thing that came after it, trying to find a configuration of the future that didn't have a fault line running through it. He couldn't find one. He'd tried enough times to accept that he probably wasn't going to. The Thursday sessions continued. He and Victoria had not spoken since the diner except through Priya, the usual logistics, nothing that gave anything away. Sitting in the conference room those last 3 weeks was an exercise in a particular kind of discipline. Being present, being the same person he'd been in that room for months, while carrying something that changed the meaning of every object in it. The chessboard, the chair against the wall, the glass of water Lily always drank half of and left. He looked at these things with different eyes now and made himself look at them the same way anyway, because Lily was watching everything, and Lily would notice. What surprised him in those 3 weeks was Victoria. She was better at it than he'd expected. Not cold. She was never cold with Lily. That wasn't a capability she had in that room, but steadier than he'd anticipated from someone carrying the same weight. She sat across from Lily and played chess and asked the right questions about preparation and laughed at the right moments, the small, real laugh she had that was different from the professional one. And Mason watched her do it and understood that whatever else she was not someone who broke under load. She'd been carrying this particular thing for 8 years. 3 more weeks was not going to collapse her. He respected that without being ready to say so. One Thursday, 10 days before the tournament, Lily played the best chess Mason had ever seen her play. Not that he was qualified to evaluate it, but Gerald had said something 2 weeks ago about a threshold, a quality of play that indicated internalized understanding rather than memorized response. And Mason thought he was watching that threshold being crossed in real time. Lily was operating differently, faster in her decisions, more confident in her tactics, something in her posture that had changed from focus to certain. Victoria played against her for 90 minutes and won only the first of 3 games, and when the third ended, she set down her piece and looked at Lily with an expression that she didn't manage in time, that open, complicated expression, and Mason looked at his phone and breathed. "I think you're ready," Victoria said. "I think so too," Lily said, which was different from how she would have said it 2 months ago. 2 months ago, she would have qualified it. Mostly ready, almost ready. There are still things I need to work on. Now she said it straight, because she'd done the work and she knew it. "How do you feel about the opening prep?" "Good. I've been running through the Sicilian lines Gerald gave me. I think I'll open King's Pawn in most games. It gets complicated faster." "That suits your style." "Yeah." Lily looked at the board. "I want to win." "I know. I know second place is still good, and I know the experience matters and everything." She looked up. "But I want to win. Is that okay to say?" Victoria held her gaze. "That's exactly what you should say." Lily nodded, satisfied, and started resetting the board for one more run. Mason watched Victoria watch Lily reset the board and thought about the next week and a half and said nothing. The National Junior Open was held in a convention center on the north side of the city, the kind of building designed to be many things at once, and therefore perfectly suited to none of them. Too large, slightly echoey, with fluorescent lighting that flattened everything and a faint institutional smell that Mason associated with waiting. There were 63 players in Lily's division, ages 8 through 10 from 11 different states. The tournament was structured across 2 days, preliminary rounds on Saturday, quarterfinals and semifinals through Sunday morning, finals on Sunday afternoon. Mason had taken the full weekend off work. He'd had to negotiate with Dave Kellerman, which had involved a conversation that ended with Dave saying, "I understand," once in the warning shot way, and once in what Mason thought was actually genuine understanding, which he hadn't expected. He'd booked a hotel room 2 blocks from the convention center, a basic room with 2 beds, not expensive, the kind of place that was clean and functional and had decent Wi-Fi, which was all Lily cared about because she'd brought her laptop to review games in the evenings. Victoria arrived at the convention center on Saturday morning at 9:15. She didn't make a production of it. No entourage, none of the visible apparatus of her professional life. She came in through the main entrance in a coat Mason hadn't seen before, dark green, and looked around the atrium until she found them, and then walked over with the same directness she walked everywhere. Lily saw her first. "You came." "I said I would." Victoria looked at Mason briefly. Something passed between them. Not quite acknowledgement, but the compressed version of it that people use when there's an agreement to behave normally in a given space. "How are you feeling?" "Good. I slept okay." Lily had been awake at 6:30, which Mason knew because he'd been awake at 5:45 and heard her moving around. But by the time he'd knocked on the bathroom door, she'd said she was fine and meant it. She'd eaten breakfast. Not much, but something. And on the drive over had been quiet in the productive way rather than the anxious way. "I want to see the playing hall before it starts." "Let's go then," Mason said. The playing hall was large and already full of the particular tension of people who cared intensely about something and were managing that care in public. 63 boards arranged in rows, DGT clocks on each, the kind of setup that looked serious because it was serious. Lily walked through it slowly, reading board numbers, finding hers. She stood at it for a moment and looked at the empty chair across from her, and then at the clock, and then at the position of the board on the table. "Can I move this slightly?" she asked a volunteer coordinator walking past. The coordinator looked at her. She was 8 years old, in a blue jacket, entirely focused, and said, "Sure, just not past the edge of the table." Lily adjusted the board 2 inches to the left. Then she stepped back and looked at it. "Okay?" "Okay?" Mason asked. Now the light's not reflecting off the white squares as much. It was going to be slightly distracting. He looked at the board. He could not see what she was seeing. "Whatever you say." They walked out of the playing hall, and Victoria bought Lily a bottle of water from a vendor in the atrium, and the 3 of them stood near a window, and the morning sun came in at a low angle, and the tournament was 45 minutes from starting, and nobody said the things that were underneath the things they were saying. And Mason thought this was either a remarkable act of collective discipline or simply what it looked like when 3 people who cared about each other were protecting something together, even when they didn't all know exactly what was being protected. Lily won her first 4 games. Not easily. The first one was tight, a 50-move grind against a 9-year-old from Ohio who played a methodical positional style that took Lily 30 minutes to crack. The second was faster, a tactical game that collapsed in Lily's favor around move 30. The third was the hardest of the day, against a girl named Preeti who was seeded second in the division and who played with the aggressive confidence of someone who expected to win, which pushed Lily into defensive positions she'd been trained to handle and handled. Though Mason spent 20 minutes watching with his hands clasped in front of his mouth, saying nothing to anyone. The fourth game finished at 5:40 in the afternoon. Lily shook her opponent's hand, a mechanical, stunned boy who'd apparently had a very good morning and a bad afternoon, and came out of the playing hall and found Mason and Victoria in the atrium where they'd been for most of the day, trading minimal conversation and a lot of watching through the glass panels. 4-0, Lily said. "I know," Mason said. "I was watching." She looked tired, genuinely tired, the way you are after a day of work that matters. Not the theatrical exhaustion of performance, but the real kind, quiet and bone deep. She leaned against the wall next to Mason, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she let him, which she didn't always in public spaces. And Victoria stood a few feet away and watched them with an expression she'd stopped trying to fully manage about 2 hours into the day. "Game 3, Lily said. "I was in trouble around move 22. "You got out of it," Mason said. "I got out of it by doing something slightly wrong that happened to work. Gerald would not approve." "Gerald isn't here." "He'd be able to tell from the score sheet." She straightened up. "I need to eat something real, not tournament food." They went to a restaurant 3 blocks away that Mason had looked up the previous night. A straightforward Italian place, comfortable, not the kind of place where people paid attention to who was sitting 2 tables over, which he'd specifically looked for. They ate, and Lily talked through all 4 games in approximate detail, while Mason followed as much as he could, and Victoria followed completely, asking questions that helped Lily work through the parts she was still processing, the mistakes and near mistakes, and the 2 or 3 moments of genuine precision that even Lily, in her honest way, acknowledged had been exactly right. It was, Mason thought, a good dinner, despite everything, or alongside everything, which wasn't quite the same thing. He walked Lily back to the hotel at 8:15 and got her settled, and she was asleep before 9. And he sat at the small desk near the window with the room dark, except the parking lot light coming through the curtain, and thought about tomorrow. Dust. Sunday moved differently. The quarterfinals were in the morning, and Lily won them in 41 moves against a composed, careful player from Texas who couldn't find a way through her defense. The semifinals were after lunch, and Mason ate nothing at the hotel restaurant and told himself he wasn't nervous and was obviously nervous, which Lily noticed. "You're worse at this than I am," she told him at 12:30, eating half a sandwich with the mechanical focus of someone fueling a machine. "I'm not nervous," Mason said. "Your left knee has been bouncing since breakfast." He pressed his knee flat. "That's just a habit." "It's a nervous habit. You do it when you're worried about money, too." She ate the other half of the sandwich. "I'm not worried. You shouldn't be worried." "I'm not worried about the chess," he said, which was true. She looked at him. He had a brief, vertiginous sense of her about to ask what he was worried about, the direct question he'd been deflecting for 3 weeks. But she looked at him and then looked away and said, "Okay," and went back to her sandwich, and he understood that she was filing this the way he filed things. Not now, but not forgotten either. The semifinal was against a boy named Daniel Park, who was seeded first in the division and who played, in Mason's observation, like a small adult, contained, deliberate economy of motion at the board. He was very good. The game lasted 74 moves and ended in Lily's favor by a margin that Gerald, reviewing the score sheet later, described as technically sound and emotionally controlled, which from Gerald was about as high as praise got. Lily came out of the playing hall for the second time that day and sat down on a bench in the corridor and put her face in her hands for about 10 seconds. "Lily," Mason started. "I'm fine," she said, face still in her hands. "I just need a second." He sat down next to her. Victoria sat on her other side. None of them said anything. The corridor moved around them, other players and parents and tournament volunteers, the ambient noise of an event that was still happening. After about 30 seconds, Lily lifted her face and looked at the ceiling and then looked at Mason. "I'm in the finals," she said. Came out slightly disbelieving, like she'd known it was possible and still hadn't fully prepared for it being real. "Yeah," Mason said. "You are." She turned and looked at Victoria. Victoria was looking back at her with the expression, that one, the open one, the one she'd stopped managing, and said, "You've been the best player in this building all day." Lily's face did the thing it almost never did. It opened, completely and without reserve, into a smile that made her look 8 years old in the most uncomplicated way. The way she'd looked on the very first Thursday when Mason had said Thursday. The smile that came in and then got pulled back. Except this time she didn't pull it back. She let it stay. Then she leaned over and put her head on Victoria's shoulder. Victoria went completely still. Not rigid, still in the way of someone who has been handed something they have wanted for a very long time and are afraid to move in case it turns out to be conditional. Her hand came up slowly and rested on Lily's hair, light as possible, like something she didn't entirely trust herself to do. Mason watched this and felt something in his chest move, some internal structure shifting to accommodate a new weight, and looked away at the corridor wall and pressed the heels of his hands briefly against his eyes. The finals were in 3 hours. The conference room they used for the waiting time was small and off the main corridor, borrowed from the convention center's administrative wing. It had a table and chairs and no chessboard, which Lily said was fine. She didn't want to play any more practice chess, she just wanted to think. She sat with her knees pulled up on a chair and her notebook open but not writing in it, and Mason sat across from her, and Victoria sat to the side, and for an hour very little was said that was about chess. At some point, Lily asked Victoria, "Do you get nervous? Before big things?" "Yes." "What do you do?" Victoria thought about it. "I try to figure out what the worst realistic outcome is. Not the catastrophic one, the realistic one. And then I figure out what I'd actually do if that happened. And usually once I've worked that out, the fear changes shape. It doesn't go away, but it compresses. It becomes something manageable." Lily considered this. "What's the worst realistic outcome today?" "You play below your level and lose." "And what would I do?" "You'd figure out exactly what went wrong. You'd work on it, and you'd come back." Lily nodded slowly. "That's not so bad." "No." "I still want to win, though." "I know." Victoria paused. "So do I." Mason had been watching this exchange from across the table. He looked at Victoria now, and she looked at him, and between them was the weight of the thing they were carrying together without Lily's knowledge, the thing that was going to change the shape of the room they were all sitting in some number of hours or days. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked at Lily. "You've put in the work," he said. "Whatever happens in there, that doesn't change." Lily looked at him with the specific expression she reserved for when he said exactly the right thing. Surprised that he'd found it, and then not surprised because he usually did. She uncurled from this chair and came around the table and hugged him, a real one, arms fully engaged, her chin on his shoulder. "I know, Dad," she said into his jacket. He held on for an extra second before letting go. The final was against a girl named Cassandra Webb, 11 years old, the oldest player in the division, who had won this tournament the previous year and who carried herself with the particular confidence of someone returning to a place they considered theirs. She was taller than Lily by about 4 inches, sat with impeccable posture, and opened with a queen's gambit that signaled she had prepared specifically. She'd seen the score sheets. She knew what Lily played. She had a plan. Mason sat with Victoria in the spectators' area. 40, maybe 50 people, parents and coaches, and other players who'd finished their own games and stayed to watch. The room was quiet, in the way chess rooms are quiet. Not silent, but a specific subdued attention, the rustle of chairs and the occasional murmur, the clocks ticking. Victoria was very still beside him. He was not still. His left knee had resumed its habit, which he didn't bother stopping. Lily, at the board, looked like herself. That was the thing he kept coming back to as he watched. She looked like herself, not like a version of herself trying to be bigger than she was. She sat across from Cassandra Webb without visible intimidation, studied the board with her usual focused stillness, moved with the deliberate economy he'd been watching for 3 years. Whatever she was feeling, it was inside, managed, working in her favor rather than against her. The first hour passed without any decisive advantage on either side. Cassandra was good, patient and precise, with a deep understanding of pawn structure that kept pushing Lily towards slightly worse positions, never dramatically worse, never enough to lose on, but consistently slightly worse, which was its own kind of pressure. Mason didn't have the vocabulary to describe exactly what he was seeing, but he could feel the tension in it, the incremental compression. Around move 35, Victoria leaned slightly forward. He looked at her. Her eyes were on the board, tracking something. He waited. "She sees it," Victoria said, very quietly, not to anyone in particular. "Sees what?" Victoria didn't answer for a moment. Then, "Cassandra's been building pressure on the queen side for 30 moves. Lily's been defending it, just barely. But that means the king side is... Cassandra's pieces on the king side are slightly miscoordinated. There's a window." She paused. "It's dangerous. It requires giving up a pawn to open it. If Lily's seen it, she's about to do something that looks wrong." Mason looked at the board. He understood approximately nothing of the specific geometry she was describing. He looked at Lily. Lily picked up her bishop. She moved it to a square that Mason could not evaluate, setting it on the board with a quiet precision. Cassandra looked at the move for a long time, longer than she'd taken on any previous move. Her posture changed slightly, just slightly. She saw it, Victoria said. The next 15 moves were the most tense thing Mason had ever sat through that didn't involve a medical emergency. He couldn't follow every exchange. Pieces came off the board, positions simplified and then suddenly complicated again. Clocks ticked down. But he could feel the room responding to what was happening. The slight leaning forward of spectators, the quality of attention that gathered around a board when something real was being decided. With 12 moves to go, Cassandra's position was visibly worse. Not collapsed. She was good enough to prevent collapse, to keep finding moves that prolonged the game, but structurally losing, the way a building is structurally compromised before any visible crack appears. With 5 moves to go, she was looking at the board with her chin in her hand and her earlier confidence entirely replaced by something that was working very hard to stay composed. Lily moved her rook. She set it down and looked at the board and then at the clock, and then she looked at nothing in particular, just the middle distance, the way she looked when she was running a final calculation and finding what she expected to find. Cassandra studied the board for 4 minutes. Mason counted because he needed something to do with the time. Then Cassandra reached out and tipped her king. The room exhaled. Lily sat very still for a moment. She looked at the board. She looked at Cassandra and said something which Mason couldn't hear but which made Cassandra nod, not gladly, but genuinely, in the way opponents acknowledge something real. Then Lily pushed back her chair and stood up and looked across the room. She found Mason first, the way she always found him first. He stood up. He did not trust his voice for a moment, so he just held her gaze and nodded. And she nodded back, that small, precise nod. And he felt something loosen in him that had been tight all day, maybe longer, maybe for weeks. Then she looked at Victoria. Victoria was standing. Her hands were pressed together in front of her mouth. Her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't entirely composed, wasn't entirely managed, and she didn't try to make it otherwise. Lily walked across the room toward them, through the people who were beginning to stand and move and talk. And when she reached them, Mason put his arms around her and she held on, and he felt her shaking slightly. Not crying, just the body releasing what it had been holding all day. "You did it," he said into her hair. "Yeah," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "Yeah, I did." After a moment, she stepped back. She looked at Victoria. Victoria reached out and put both hands on Lily's face, very briefly, cupping it the way you'd cup something fragile and important. Her eyes were bright and her mouth was doing something complicated, and she said, "I knew you would," in a voice that was not entirely steady, and Lily looked back at her with that open expression, and the moment sat there between them, visible and real and unreachable from the outside. Mason watched it. He thought, not tonight. She'd just won the most important thing she'd ever competed for. She needed to eat and sleep and feel the shape of it. Not tonight, tomorrow. They went back to the hotel. Lily had a small trophy, an actual physical trophy, not large but real, something you could hold. And she set it on the desk in the room and looked at it while Mason ordered room service, which was not something they usually did, but which tonight he decided was justified. Lily ate more than she had all day and talked in the scattered, slightly giddy way she talked when something had genuinely surprised her, even when she'd prepared for it, looping back to specific moments in the final game, to the bishop move at 35. To what Cassandra had said when she resigned, which was, "You're very good," in a tone that Lily said was sincere and slightly annoyed, which she respected. She fell asleep with the television on, which she never did at home. Mason turned it off and sat in the chair by the window in the dark for a while before going to bed. He'd sent Victoria a text at 10. Just, "Tomorrow. Same diner, 9 o'clock. We should do it before she has too much time to think about the fact that something is coming." She'd replied within 2 minutes. "I'll be there." He looked at his daughter sleeping, the trophy on the desk, the city quiet outside the window. He thought about what tomorrow contained. He thought about what you owed a person. A child, specifically, this particular child, who had been held in good faith by two different people who both loved her in entirely different ways for entirely different reasons, both imperfectly, both without a complete picture. He thought about the conversation that was coming and what Lily would do with it. Whether she would go internal, go still, or whether she'd be angry, or whether she'd be something he hadn't predicted, because Lily always had a third option he hadn't thought of. He didn't know. He sat with that and looked at her until he was tired enough to sleep. At 8:45 the next morning, while Mason was in the shower and Lily was sitting on her bed eating a granola bar and looking at the trophy, she set down the granola bar and said to the empty room, in the careful voice she used when she was working something out, "Something's going on." She'd known it for 3 weeks. She hadn't said it because the tournament was coming and she could feel that naming it would destabilize something she needed stable. But the tournament was over now, and the feeling was still there. The slight wrongness in the room, in both of them, a thing they were holding that they weren't saying. She wasn't scared of it. That surprised her slightly. She thought she probably should be, because whatever it was had been big enough to make her father lose sleep, and big enough to make Victoria cry almost, at the tournament, and both of them were people who did not fall apart easily. But she wasn't scared. She picked up the trophy and turned it in her hands. She could handle most things. She'd learned that from her father, who handled things every day without making them into more than they were. And she'd learned it from chess, which had taught her that the position on the board was never as good or as bad as it felt in the moment of staring at it. It was just a position. There were always moves. She heard the shower stop. She set the trophy back down on the desk. Whatever was coming, she'd figure out her moves when she saw the position. That was what she did. Mason came out of the shower to find Lily already dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed with the trophy in her lap, turning it slowly in her hands the way she turned chess pieces when she was thinking. "You hungry?" he asked. "A little." She looked up at him. "Are we meeting Victoria this morning?" He stopped toweling his hair. "What makes you ask that?" "Because you texted someone at 10 o'clock last night, and you had the face you have when something is decided." She set the trophy back on the desk. "And because something has been going on for a few weeks, and you've both been carrying it, and I've been waiting for the tournament to end." Mason sat down on the edge of his bed across from her. He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, hair slightly messy from sleep, clear-eyed in the particular way she was clear-eyed when she'd already thought something through and was waiting for the adults to catch up. "Yeah," he said. "We're meeting Victoria. Is it bad?" He thought about how to answer that. "It's big," he said finally. "I don't know yet if it's bad. I think that depends on a lot of things." Lily looked at him steadily. "Okay. Okay. I said I'd figure out my moves when I saw the position." She picked up her jacket from the chair. "Can we get breakfast first? Real breakfast, not granola bars." He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Real breakfast." They ate at a place 2 doors down from the hotel, a small spot with good eggs and coffee that came without being asked. Lily ate most of her plate, which was a good sign. She only lost her appetite when she was genuinely frightened, and she wasn't frightened, or at least not in the way that cost her hunger. Mason ate less than he should have and drank more coffee than was advisable, and watched his daughter and thought about how to begin what was coming, and couldn't find a clean entry point, which was fine because there wasn't one. Some conversations don't have clean entry points. They just have the moment you start them. Calloway's diner was 7 minutes away. Victoria was already in the booth when they arrived, the same one, in the back, which Mason noted was either coincidence or the kind of careful attention to detail he'd come to associate with her. She had coffee. She was in a dark coat, her hair down, and she looked like someone who had not slept particularly well, which he respected because he hadn't either. She saw Lily come in behind him, and her face did the thing it always did, that immediate loosening, involuntary, the gladness that existed before she could manage it. And then something else, something more complicated, a tightening behind the eyes that was the weight of what she was about to say. Lily slid into the booth first, across from Victoria. Mason sat beside his daughter. For a moment, nobody said anything. The diner moved around them. The waitress came and Mason ordered coffee, and Lily asked for hot chocolate, and the waitress wrote it down and left. And then the three of them were looking at each other in the particular silence of a conversation that everybody knows is coming, but nobody wants to be the first to enter. Victoria looked at Mason. He gave the smallest nod. She turned to Lily. I need to tell you something, Victoria said. And I need you to know that I've thought very carefully about how to say it, and I still don't think there's a good way. So I'm just going to say it as clearly as I can, and then we'll figure out the rest together. Lily was very still. Not the rigid stillness of fear, but the active stillness of someone listening with everything they have. 8 years ago, Victoria said, when I was 22, I had a baby, a girl. She stopped. Her voice was controlled, but the effort of controlling it was visible. I wasn't in a position to be her mother, not in the way she deserved. I was young, and I was under pressure I can't fully explain to you right now, and I made a decision to give her up through a private agency. I signed the papers and I left, and I told myself it was the right decision, and I spent 8 years trying to believe that. Lily was looking at her. When I met you, Victoria said, there was something. I told myself I was wrong, that I was pattern matching, seeing something I wanted to see. But the feeling didn't go away. It kept building. She paused. About a month ago, I had a DNA test done, without asking you, without asking your dad. She looked at Mason briefly. That was wrong. I've told your dad that, and I'm telling you. She looked back at Lily. The test came back. And Lily, you're my biological daughter. The silence that followed was not like other silences. Lily sat across from Victoria and did not move and did not look away. The hot chocolate arrived, and the waitress set it down and left, and nobody looked at it. Mason watched his daughter's face with the total attention of someone who had one job in this moment, and this was it. Lily's face was very still. The kind of still that wasn't absence of feeling, but was feeling too large and too many to have a single expression. You gave me up, Lily said finally. Her voice was quiet and flat and careful. Yes. When I was a baby. Yes. Lily looked at the table. Her hands were flat on the surface, and Mason could see that she was breathing with deliberateness, the way she breathed when she was working through something at the board that was more complicated than expected. He didn't touch her. He waited, because she needed to find her own way to the first word that came after this, and nobody could find it for her. Did you know who my dad was? Lily asked. Like, did you know he would be my dad? No, Victoria said. The adoption was closed. I signed papers, and I wasn't supposed to know anything. I wasn't supposed to ever know where you went. So you didn't choose him? No. Lily looked at Mason. He held her gaze and said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet. But you got me anyway, Lily said to him. Not a question. Yeah, he said. I got you. Lily looked back at Victoria. Her expression had shifted slightly, something moving underneath the stillness, working its way toward the surface. Why are you telling me now? Victoria blinked. What do you mean? I mean, why not before? You've known for a month. Why didn't you tell me before the tournament? Because your dad and I agreed that you deserved to have the tournament without this on top of it. A pause. And because we were afraid of what it might do to your focus. You made that decision for me, Lily said, without asking. Yes. Lily was quiet again. Mason watched the shape of what she was doing, not shutting down, not erupting, something in between that was characteristically hers, the way she processed information that required processing, taking it in piece by piece, looking at each piece. Are you my mother? Lily asked. The word landed in the middle of the table like something that had been dropped from a height. Victoria looked at her. Her composure was still intact on the surface, barely. Biologically, she said carefully. I don't want to tell you what to call me. I don't think I've earned that. I don't think you owe me anything, Lily. I want to be honest with you about what the test showed, and I want you to know that whatever you decide to do with that, whatever you want our relationship to look like, I'll follow your lead. Lily looked at her for a long moment. Do you want to be? She asked. Victoria blinked. Do I want to be what? My mother. Lily's voice was not cruel and not gentle. It was direct. Not biologically. Actually, do you want to be in my life in that way? It was not a question a 30-year-old woman expected to be asked by an 8-year-old, and Victoria did not have a prepared answer for it, which meant the answer that came out was the real one. Yes, she said. I know I don't have the right to want that. I know I gave up any claim to that when you were 3 days old. But yes, that's the truth. Lily nodded. She looked at her hot chocolate. She wrapped her hands around the mug the way she'd watched Victoria wrap her hands around a coffee cup 100 Thursday afternoons, and the similarity of the gesture sat in the space between them, visible and quiet. I need to think, Lily said. Okay, Mason said. Not right now. I need time. Days, maybe. She looked up at both of them. I don't know how I feel yet. I know that's probably not what you wanted to hear. It's exactly what you should say, Victoria said, and her voice had the same quality it had had at the tournament prep session, the same certainty attached to something real. Lily looked at her. Something crossed her face. Not forgiveness, not resolution, something earlier and smaller than those things. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of a specific kind of honesty. Okay, Lily said. She picked up her mug. Can we just sit here for a while? I don't want to go back to the hotel yet. Yeah, Mason said. We can do that. They sat. The diner moved around them. The morning went on the way mornings do, indifferent to the size of what was happening in a corner booth, and the three of them sat with the weight of it and didn't try to make it lighter or resolve it into something neater than it was. The days that followed were not clean. Lily was quieter than usual, which Mason monitored with the careful attention he gave to things that worried him. She ate normally, slept normally, went to school and came home and did her homework, and wasn't visibly broken, but she moved through the apartment with a quality of interiority that was different from her usual focus, more private, more sealed. She didn't bring it up, and he didn't push. He told himself giving her space was the right thing, and some days he believed it, and some days he woke at 3 a.m. convinced he was doing it wrong. On the 4th day, she came into the kitchen while he was washing dishes after dinner and stood at the counter and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "When you adopted me, what did they tell you about where I came from?" He turned off the water. He dried his hands. He turned to face her and leaned against the counter because this conversation deserved his full posture. "They told me you were born to a young woman who wasn't able to care for you. They didn't give me a name. I didn't ask for one." He paused. "I thought about it sometimes, who she was, what the circumstances were. But I decided early on that that was your information when you were ready for it, not mine to go looking for." Lily considered this. "Did you ever think she might be someone like Victoria? Like someone successful, someone who had money?" "I thought she might be any kind of person," he said. "That's the only honest answer." Lily looked at the table. "Do you think she was telling the truth about why she did it, the pressure, and being young?" "I think she was telling the truth as she understands it," Mason said carefully. "I think there are probably parts of it she still hasn't fully worked out. 22 is young. Family pressure can do things to you that take a long time to understand." He paused. "That's not me defending what she did. I'm not sure I'm the right person to defend or not defend it. But I don't think she was lying to you." Lily nodded slowly. "She's been kind to me this whole time," she said, "even before she knew for sure. That's not nothing." "No," Mason said. "It's not nothing. But she also did the test without asking." "Yes." "Which was wrong." "Yes." Lily was quiet for a moment. "She told me that, though. She told me it was wrong before I could say it. She didn't make excuses." She looked up. "Most people make excuses." Mason thought about what it had taken for Victoria to sit in a booth at Calloway's diner at 7:30 in the morning and say, "I know this was wrong and I did it anyway," to the person it affected most. He thought about the shape of a person who could do that. Not easily, not without cost, but with the discipline of someone who had decided that honesty was the thing they were not going to compromise on, even when it was expensive. "Most people do," he agreed. Lily went back to her room. Mason stood in the kitchen for a while, then went and sat on the couch and looked at nothing for 20 minutes. On the 7th day, Lily asked if they could call Victoria. Not a visit. A call. Mason understood the distinction. A visit was more than she was ready for. A call was a controlled thing, manageable, the kind of interaction where you could end it if you needed to. He texted Victoria. She called back in 4 minutes. He handed the phone to Lily and went to the kitchen and stood there, not quite out of earshot but far enough to be decent about it, and listened to the silence and the occasional word. The call lasted 11 minutes. He heard Lily say, "I know" twice, and "okay" once, and near the end, something he couldn't make out that was followed by a longer silence, and then what sounded like both of them breathing. Lily came to the kitchen doorway and handed him the phone. "She wants to talk to you," Lily said. He took the phone. "Hey." "She's remarkable," Victoria said. Her voice was controlled but had the quality of something recently compressed, recently held together by active effort. "She told me she's not ready to change anything yet, that she wants things to stay how they are for now, with the Thursdays and the chess and just how they've been. And she wants to figure out the rest as she goes." "Yeah," Mason said. "That sounds like her. She also told me—" A pause. "She said she's not angry. She said she understands that sometimes people make decisions when they're young that they spend the rest of their life trying to make sense of, and that she's going to think about it more, and she'll tell me what she decides." Mason leaned against the counter. "She's 8. "I know. She talks like that, and I forget she's 8. "So do I," Victoria said quietly. "So do I." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" "I don't know yet." A pause. "I think I will be. I think this is the beginning of something that's going to take time. And I'm okay with that. I'm better at time than I used to be." "That's growth," Mason said, which came out drier than he intended, and Victoria actually laughed. A short, real, slightly startled sound that was nothing like the professional version. "I suppose it is," she said. They hung up. Mason put the phone on the counter and looked at the doorway where Lily had been standing. He heard her in her room, the small sounds of someone moving around their space, normal sounds, the sounds of a life continuing. He breathed out. The Thursdays continued. They continued because Lily wanted them to, stated directly on a Wednesday evening 2 weeks after the tournament, when she came out of her room and said to Mason, "I want to go back on Thursday. Is that happening?" And Mason said yes, and it was. The first Thursday back was different from all the ones before. Not worse, different, more aware of itself. Victoria was there with the board set up and 2 cups of coffee and Lily's water, and Lily came in and sat down and looked at the board and looked at Victoria and said, "Hi." And Victoria said, "Hi." And there was a moment, maybe 4 seconds, where everything that had happened existed fully in the room, visible and acknowledged. And then Lily reached out and moved her first piece. They didn't talk about it that day, or the next Thursday. They played chess and talked about other things. History, what Lily's teacher had said about a science project, a building Victoria was considering acquiring that had some complicated history attached to it. And the relationship rebuilt itself around the new information the way a structure reinforces itself after a shift, finding the load-bearing points and adjusting. What changed was small and cumulative. Lily started calling her Victoria without the slight pause she'd had before, the pause of not quite knowing what they were. Victoria started asking about things at school with the specific follow-up quality of someone who was tracking an ongoing situation, not just making conversation. Mason started arriving at the Thursday sessions with slightly less of the watchfulness he'd carried the first months, not lowering it entirely because he was who he was, but redistributing it, spending it on different things. One Thursday in April, about 5 weeks after the tournament, Victoria arrived with a folder. She set it on the table before they started playing, and Lily looked at it and asked what it was. "I had an idea," Victoria said, "and this time I'm asking first." Lily waited. There are a lot of kids who would be good at chess who never find out, because they don't have access to the right resources. Programs, coaches, tournaments, the things that would have made a difference for you if you'd had them earlier. Victoria opened the folder. Inside were documents. Early stage clearly, outlines and financial projections, and a name at the top, the Hart Foundation for Youth Chess. "I want to start a foundation, focused on underserved kids in the metro area, eventually nationally. Scholarships, coaching, tournament entry, equipment for schools that can't afford sets. She looked at Lily. I want your name on it, not as a figurehead, as a real part of how it works. You'd be involved in decisions about what it does. Lily looked at the folder. She looked at Victoria. Why my name? Because it should have your name. Victoria's voice was even. Because this is in part about what I should have been doing for 8 years and wasn't. Because you deserve to have something in the world that carries your name and does something real. She paused. And because you're going to be the best chess player this city has produced in 30 years, and kids who are like you or deserve to know that someone is coming for them. Lily was quiet for a long moment. You should have asked me before you made the folder, she said. Victoria almost smiled. I didn't make any legal commitments. I just thought it through. That's different from asking. It is different from asking. You're right. Lily looked at Mason. He raised his eyebrows slightly in a gesture that meant, this is your call. She looked back at the folder. Can I be actually involved? She said. Not just my name on it. Actually deciding things. Yes. Can I talk to the kids who get the scholarships? Like actually talk to them, not just be a picture on a website? Yes. Can we include girls specifically? Because chess programs are usually already in the outline, Victoria said, turning to a page in the folder. See? Lily looked at the page. Something shifted in her face. The careful reserve she'd been maintaining, not gone, but permitting something through. Okay, she said. Okay? Yeah. Lily closed the folder. Let's play first, then we can talk about the foundation. Victoria put the folder aside. They played. What? The months that followed were not a fairy tale because real things aren't, and the people in them were not built for fairy tales. Mason had a difficult stretch in May when 2 jobs fell through in the same week, and the savings account dipped in a way that kept him up at night for 10 days until a large contract came through and stabilized things. He didn't tell Victoria about it, and then he did because she asked directly after noticing he was distracted during a Thursday session, and the conversation that followed was one of the harder ones they'd had, not because she offered money, which she didn't, but because she asked honest questions about what he needed, and he had to figure out how to answer them honestly without either deflecting or accepting more than felt right. Victoria had her own version of a difficult stretch in June. A board challenge that had been building since February finally came to a head, the same man she'd mentioned in the fall, and navigating it required 3 weeks of the kind of sustained, draining political work that left her arriving at Thursday sessions worn in a way she could feel and Lily could see. Lily, to her credit, mostly said nothing and played chess, which was the right call, and which Victoria later told Mason she had understood as kindness. Lily turned 9 in July. They celebrated at the apartment. Mason made dinner, real dinner, the kind that required an actual grocery run and an hour of cooking, and Victoria came and brought a book that Lily had mentioned once, offhandedly, in January, which Lily noticed and held up, and looked at her with an expression that said, You remembered that. And Victoria said, I remember most things you say. And Lily said, That's a lot of pressure. And Victoria said, You manage it fine. And Mason watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway and felt something quiet and full in his chest that he didn't have a word for, but recognized as a kind of wealth that had nothing to do with money. The foundation took shape through the summer. Lily was, as she'd insisted, actually involved. She sat in 2 planning meetings in Victoria's conference room, the same room where it had all started, and asked questions that made the legal consultant present blink and recalibrate twice. She had opinions about the selection criteria for scholarships and the importance of pairing financial support with genuine mentorship, not just resources, but people, which Mason heard her argue for in a room full of adults with the same steady directness she brought to every board she sat across from. He drove her home from the second meeting, and she was quiet for the first 10 minutes, looking out the window, and then she said, I think it's going to actually help people. Yeah, Mason said. I think so too. Not just chess help, like, if the right kid finds chess, it changes how they think. It changes what they think is possible. She paused. It did that for me. Chess did that for you? She thought about it. Chess and you, she said. Same thing, mostly. He drove and did not say anything for a moment because his throat was doing something he'd rather not acknowledge at 60 miles per hour on a surface road. "You're going to make me crash the truck," he said. Lily looked at him. "I said a nice thing and you're making it weird." "I'm not making it weird. I'm emotionally processing." "While driving?" "I'm a multitasker." She shook her head and looked back out the window, but the corner of her mouth was doing the left before right thing, the small asymmetric thing, and Mason looked at the road and breathed. The question of what Lily called Victoria resolved itself the way most real things resolve, gradually and without a single decisive moment, through accumulation rather than declaration. It was September, a Thursday, late afternoon. Mason had been out in the hallway taking a call from a contractor and came back to find Lily telling Victoria about something that had happened at school, a disagreement with a teacher over a history question that Lily had researched and believed she was right about and had handled, she was reporting, with only moderate diplomacy. Victoria was listening with her chin in her hand and her expression walking the line between serious and amused. "What did you say to her?" "I said that the source she cited was contested by more recent scholarship and that if she wanted, I could send her the papers." "And?" "She didn't want the papers." "How did it end?" "She said I was technically correct, but that the way I delivered it needed work." Lily considered this. "She's probably right about the delivery." "Growth," Victoria said. Lily looked at her. "That's what my dad says. Exactly like that. We agree on most things that matter." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "What do you want me to call you?" Victoria looked at her. The question had the quality of something that had been held for a while and was now being set down carefully. "I told you before," Victoria said. "That's your decision." "I know, but I'm asking what you want." Victoria was quiet for a moment. In the doorway, Mason stood very still with his phone in his hand. "I want whatever you're comfortable with," Victoria said. "Whatever feels honest to you. I don't need a title. I need the Thursdays. I need to watch you play. I need to know you're okay." She paused. "Everything else is yours to give or not give." Lily looked at the chessboard. "I have a dad," she said. "He's my dad. That's not a question." She looked up at Victoria. "But you're not nothing. You're something. I don't think there's a word for exactly what you are." "Probably not," Victoria agreed. "So I'll figure it out as I go," Lily said. "If that's okay." "That's okay." Lily nodded. Then she reached out and moved her first piece. Mason walked back into the room and sat down in his chair against the wall and picked up his phone and didn't look at it. Tip. There is a particular thing that happens when you've been carrying something for a long time and you set it down. Not relief exactly. Relief implies the weight was only bad, and this weight had never been only bad. It had been complicated in the way that anything real is complicated, threaded through with things that mattered, which is what made it heavy in the first place. What happens when you set it down is closer to clarity. The ability to see the room you're standing in without the distortion of the thing you've been holding in front of your face. Mason sat in his chair on a Thursday evening in October. 8 months, roughly, since the morning he'd brought his daughter into a broken elevator building to fix a server room and walked out with something he couldn't name, and looked at Lily and Victoria across the chessboard and let himself see it clearly. Two people who had found each other by a route that was improbable and imperfect and full of decisions that none of them would have designed if they'd been given the choice. A woman who had made a terrible decision at 22 under pressures she'd spent 8 years not looking at directly and who was now, imperfectly, showing up. A girl who had understood from the beginning, in her precise and honest way, that the world was not made of smooth outcomes and clear categories, and who had decided that understanding was enough to work with. A man who had spent 8 years being everything his daughter needed and who was only now, slowly, learning what it felt like to not do all of it alone. None of it was clean. The foundation planning meetings sometimes got tense when Lily pushed back on decisions that felt performative rather than substantive. Victoria still occasionally made choices without consulting the people those choices affected, and still occasionally had to be told so. Mason still woke at 3 in the morning doing the financial arithmetic. And some months it still didn't come out the way he needed it to, and the gap between what Lily deserved and what he could provide on his own was a thing he was still learning to let other people help with. Lily was still, at 9, a person whose social world was narrower than was entirely healthy, and she still had to work at the delivery of her directness, and she still sometimes chose the correct chess move and forgot that other people hadn't seen what she'd seen and needed to be shown the path. But she laughed more than she used to. Not the almost smile she'd rationed, the one that came in and then got pulled back. The real one. It surfaced more easily now, stayed longer, didn't require guarding. Mason thought about what Victoria had said in the diner back in February, about the room that was always there. He thought about his own room. The box on the highest shelf, the photograph in the envelope. He thought about how long he'd kept that door closed. Not because opening it would destroy anything, but because closing it had become a habit so old he'd stopped examining it. A way of managing something that didn't need managing anymore, or not in the same way. He was, he thought, a person in the process of opening a door. It was a slow process, and it was not always comfortable, and he was not sure what the room was going to look like when he finally got it fully open. But the door was moving. He looked at Lily, who was looking at the board with the focused stillness of someone who had already decided her next 3 moves and was simply waiting for the right moment to make them. He looked at Victoria, who was looking at the board with the expression that had stopped being complicated somewhere around the summer. Not simple. Nothing about this was simple, but settled in a way it hadn't been before. The expression of someone who had finally put down the thing they'd been carrying and was finding out what it felt like to have their hands free. "Your move," Lily said, without looking up. Victoria moved a piece. Lily tilted her head. The left corner of her mouth moved first. Outside the window, the city went on in the ordinary way of cities, indifferent and continuous. And in the conference room on the 41st floor of the Crestfield building, the 3 of them sat around a stone and walnut chessboard and played. And it was not a perfect thing, and it was not a finished thing, and it was theirs. The Hart Foundation opened its application portal in November. In the first week, 237 kids applied for 12 scholarship spots. Lily sat in on the selection committee meeting, the youngest person in a room of lawyers and educators and Victoria, and asked a question 40 minutes in that redirected the entire discussion about the selection criteria, which the legal consultant later described to his partner as the most clarifying question anyone had asked in a committee meeting he'd attended in 15 years. The consultant did not know the question had come from a 9-year-old. Victoria did not correct him. Lily came home from that meeting and told Mason about it over dinner, and he listened and asked questions, and they talked for an hour about the difference between selecting for potential and selecting for need, and whether those 2 things were always in tension or whether the right framework made them the same thing. It was the kind of conversation Mason had not had since, he couldn't remember since when, which was itself information. After dinner, Lily washed her dishes, which she did without being asked approximately 60% of the time, which was up from 40% at the beginning of the year, which Mason chose to regard as progress. She dried her hands and leaned against the counter and looked at him. "Dad?" "Yeah." "I think the thing she did, giving me up, I think she was wrong." A pause. "But I also think she was a person making the worst decision she knew how to make at the time. And those aren't the same thing as being a bad person." Mason looked at his daughter. "No," he said, "they're not." "I've been thinking about it since March," Lily said. "I just wanted you to know where I landed. I'm glad you told me." She nodded. She picked up her book, a different annotated collection, Grandmaster Games, a birthday gift from Victoria, and went to her room. Mason stood in the kitchen for a while. He thought about imperfect people trying to do right by each other, which is most people, most of the time, if you're looking honestly. He thought about the difference between the family you're born into and the family that gets built, board by board, Thursday by Thursday, in the space between the people who show up and stay. He thought about his daughter, 9 years old, asleep by now probably, one hand tucked under her cheek the way she'd slept since she was 3, and about the woman in a building 41 floors above the city who was probably still at her desk at this hour, working through something, who had spent 8 years running from a room, and who was finally, tentatively, learning what was inside it. He thought about himself, not in a grand way, just the ordinary inventory of a man in his 30s standing in a kitchen at night, tired, aware of what he had, aware of what it had cost and was still costing, aware that cost and worth were not the same calculation. He turned off the kitchen light. In the morning, there would be work and school and the specific ordinary difficulty of a life that required constant maintenance to keep running. There would be things that didn't resolve cleanly, and conversations that had to happen more than once, and months that were harder than others, and all the imperfect work of building something that lasts. But the morning was the morning's problem. Tonight, the apartment was quiet, and Lily was sleeping, and the trophy from March was still on her desk where she'd put it and never moved it, and the room on the highest shelf had been opened, and the door was still open, and Mason Hart was okay. That was enough. That was in the end what enough looked like.